The outlaws moved fast and quiet, the way men do when they've done something they know can't be undone. There were 4 of them. They'd picked the Callaway wagon because it sat half a mile off the main trail, far enough that nobody would hear, close enough that the family might have felt safe. The father had barely gotten to his feet before the first shot dropped him. The mother screamed once. Then she didn't scream anymore. The men rifled through the wagon, took what little cash there was, took the horses, took a pocket watch, and a wool blanket, and a sack of dried beans. Things so ordinary they barely justified the blood now soaking into the Nebraska dirt. One of them almost found the hidden compartment beneath the false wagon floor. Almost. He kicked it, listened to the hollow sound, and walked away anyway, already thinking about where they'd spend the night. They never looked back. They never heard the sound that rose from that compartment after they rode off. Faint, fragile, barely human. 2 infant girls, alive in the dark, beginning to cry. If this story already has your heart in your throat, you are exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because every week we bring you stories like this one, stories that will make you feel something real. Hit the like button if you believe some things in this world are worth fighting for. And drop a comment below telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one is going to stay with you. The evening Gideon Voss rode onto Marlowe Ashby's property, the sky had already turned the color of a bruise, that particular purple-gray that comes just before the last of the light gives up entirely. Marlowe was closing up the chicken coop, her back to the trail, when she heard the horse. She didn't turn right away. Strangers passed through sometimes. Most of them kept moving, but this horse wasn't moving. It had stopped at the edge of her fence line, and it wasn't going anywhere. She turned around. The rider was upright in the saddle, but only technically. His body had the slack, boneless quality of a man held in place by nothing more than the grip of his knees, and whatever stubborn thread of consciousness was still holding on inside him. His hat had tilted forward at a strange angle. His coat was streaked dark with something Marlowe couldn't identify at that distance. Could have been mud, could have been worse. His hands, which should have been on the reins, were not on the reins. His arms were out in front of him, and in each arm he was holding a baby. Marlowe crossed the distance between them in about 4 seconds. Later she wouldn't remember making the decision to run. One moment she was standing by the coop with a latch in her hand, the next she was at the fence, reaching up, trying to understand what she was seeing. The babies were small, impossibly small, the kind of small that makes your chest hurt. Both were wrapped in the same flannel shirt, a man's shirt, large enough that it had been folded and wrapped twice around each of them. They were alive. She could see their chests moving, tiny and rapid. One of them had her eyes open and was staring at the sky with the unfocused, bewildered expression of someone who had seen too much of the world too early. The other one was asleep, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter much. "Hey!" Marlowe put her hand on the rider's arm. "Hey, look at me!" The man's eyes opened part way. They were gray, a dull, exhausted gray that had probably been sharper once. He looked at her like someone looking up from the bottom of a well. "Found them," he said. His voice was barely there. A hoarse rasp scraped clean of everything except the words themselves. "Under the wagon. Parents were—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I buried them. Couldn't leave the girls." "How long have you been riding?" He thought about it. The effort of thinking about it was visible on his face. "Since yesterday, before sunup." Marlowe did the math in her head and felt something cold move through her. She reached up and took the nearest baby, the one who was awake, the one staring at the sky, and tucked her carefully against her shoulder. The baby made a small sound, not crying, something more tentative than that, like a question. "Can you hand me the other one?" The man looked down at his right arm as though checking that it was still there. He shifted the sleeping infant carefully, with a deliberateness that had nothing automatic about it. Every movement conscious, every adjustment calculated. Someone who'd been holding these children long enough to understand exactly how they needed to be held. He passed the second baby to Marlowe, and then, without further ceremony, he tilted sideways out of the saddle. Marlowe had both babies in her arms. She couldn't catch him. All she could do was watch him hit the ground with a sound that made her wince. Not a crash, but a dull, heavy settling, like a sack of grain dropped without care. He landed on his side in the dirt beside her fence, and he did not get up. and after a moment his breathing evened out into something deep and slow that was less like a man sleeping and more like a man who had finally been allowed to stop. The horse stood quietly. The babies were warm in her arms. Marlowe stood there for a moment with two infants pressed against her chest and a stranger unconscious at her feet, and the last of the evening light fading around her, and she thought, well, that's something. Then she turned and carried the babies into the house, because they needed warmth and something to eat, and the man in her yard wasn't going anywhere. Getting him inside was a problem she solved with stubbornness and a wheelbarrow. She settled the twins in the wooden crate she used for storing quilts, patted it with the softest blankets she owned, tucked them in side by side so they could feel each other, and left the lantern burning low enough to give them warmth without risk. The awake one watched her with those unsettling, steady eyes. The sleeping one didn't stir. Then she went back outside. The man had not moved. She got her hands under his arms and pulled him toward the porch steps, which was harder than it sounds because he was not a small man, and dead weight is different from living weight in ways that are difficult to explain. She got him inside, got him onto the cot she kept in the back room, got his boots off. She found the source of the dark stain on his coat, a gash along his left side, not deep enough to be immediately dangerous, but ugly and poorly tended, the edges already starting to show the color of infection if she left it much longer. She cleaned it. He didn't wake up for any of it. She fed the babies with a cloth soaked in warm water and a little of the canned milk she kept on the highest shelf. She'd had it for months, purchased half out of habit and half out of some undefined hope she'd never let herself examine too closely. They took the feeding with remarkable composure, these two tiny girls who had been passed hand to hand through a nightmare and somehow arrived on the other side of it still breathing. Marlowe sat between the cot and the crate, with one eye on the unconscious man and one ear toward the babies, and she did not sleep at all. He woke up around dawn. She heard him before she saw it, heard the quality of his breathing change, heard the specific sound of a person registering their surroundings for the first time. She was at the stove when he spoke. The babies. In the crate. Both fine. A pause, then the creak of the cot as he moved, then a sound that was almost a groan. Don't sit up too fast, Marlowe said without turning around. You've got a cut on your side that isn't happy with you. Another pause. You tended it. Somebody had to. She turned around with 2 tin cups of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she usually rationed herself to. She figured the circumstances warranted it. He was sitting up on the cot, moving slowly and carefully the way people move when they're cataloging their injuries. He was younger than she'd expected somehow, probably mid-30s. Dark hair. A jaw that hadn't been shaved in a week at minimum. His gray eyes, now that they had some light in them, were sharper than they'd seemed the night before, watchful in a way that had probably kept him alive more than once. He took the coffee. Thank you. What's your name? Gideon Voss. Marlowe Ashby. She sat down in the chair across from him. Tell me about the wagon, he told her. It came out in pieces, the way things do when someone has been carrying them at a run for too long and has to set them down slowly. The wagon had been about 12 miles east, off the trail, partially hidden by a stand of cottonwood. He'd smelled the smoke from someone's campfire, or thought he had, and gone to investigate. Instead, he'd found a scene that he described with a flatness in his voice that told her more than any amount of detail would have. He'd known the man was dead before he got to him. The woman, too. I looked for anyone else, he said. I wasn't going to leave without being sure. I checked everything. And then I heard them. Under the wagon. There was a compartment built into the floor. Whoever built that wagon loved those children before they were even born. He stopped. His hand moved on the coffee cup. They'd been there a while. Hours, maybe. Long enough that they were cold, but not... They were all right. They were all right. Marlowe looked over at the crate. Both babies were awake now, watching the ceiling with the same philosophical attention they seemed to bring to everything. You rode through the night. Couldn't leave them somewhere to wait. No way to know who might come along. You could have gone to town. It's 8 miles. 8 miles east puts me closer to where those men went. He looked at her steadily. I wasn't going to town carrying 2 infants and advertising that there were witnesses. It took her a moment to understand what he meant. When she did, something settled differently in her chest. You were protecting them. He didn't answer that directly. He just drank his coffee and looked at the babies, and his expression had something in it that she couldn't quite name. Not sorrow exactly, something older than sorrow, something that knew what sorrow cost. "The men," Marlowe said. "Did you see them?" "Enough." "Enough to identify them?" "Enough." He set the cup down. "I need to talk to your sheriff." Sheriff Elias Mercer arrived at the Ashby Ranch by mid-morning. He was a careful man, Elias, the kind of careful that came from doing a job long enough to know that most situations were more complicated than they first appeared. He was somewhere in his 50s, built solid, but gone a little soft at the middle in the way that desk work encourages. And he had the particular talent of listening without showing on his face what he was thinking. He listened to Gideon for a long time. He looked at the babies. He looked at Marlowe. "The family's name was Calloway," he said finally. "James and Ruth Calloway. Came through Harlan County about a month ago. Word was they were heading north, looking for land." He paused. "Word also was they might have been carrying money. Inheritance from the wife's family, people said." "People said it loudly enough that the wrong men heard," Gideon said. Mercer nodded slowly. He had the look of a man confirming something he'd already suspected. "The gang's been working the eastern trails for a couple years. Mostly robbery, some violence, nothing we could pin down. 3, 4 men. Move fast, don't leave witnesses." He paused again. "Until now." "I don't know that they knew the girls were in there," Gideon said. "There's no way to know. It doesn't change what they did to the parents." "No." Gideon's voice was flat. "It doesn't." Mercer turned to Marlowe. "The children need somewhere to stay until we can locate family. Could be a day, could be longer. The circuit court judge won't be through for 2 weeks at minimum." "They stay here," Marlowe said. She hadn't planned to say it so quickly. She heard the certainty in her own voice and recognized it. The same certainty she'd felt when she'd decided to stay on this ranch after her husband died, when everyone in town had expected her to sell and go back east. Some decisions didn't require deliberation. They were already made before you opened your mouth. Mercer looked at her for a moment. "That's a significant undertaking, Mrs. Ashby. I'm aware of that. Twin infant girls. I can count, Elias." Something almost like a smile moved across Mercer's face and disappeared. "All right." He turned back to Gideon. "You'll need to come into town and give a formal account, and I'd advise you to stay close. If you can identify these men—" "I can." "Then you're the most important witness I've got." Mercer stood, put his hat back on. "Mrs. Ashby, I'll send Doc Fenner out to look at those children. They're healthy." "I'm sure they are. Send him anyway." He paused at the door. "Gideon Voss, you said you'd been riding since before sunup the previous day." "Yes." "With 2 infants." "Yes." Mercer looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said again, and left. The first real trouble came from the town. Not from everyone. Marlowe had lived in Harlan County long enough to know that most people were fundamentally decent in a slow, distracted sort of way. But there were voices, and voices had a way of getting louder in the absence of other information. Clara Nissen was the one who came to the ranch directly. Clara ran the dry goods store with her husband and was the kind of woman who considered herself honest, primarily because she said what she thought without pausing to consider whether what she thought was worth saying. She arrived on the 3rd day with a pound of sugar and what she clearly believed was a neighborly concern. "People are asking questions," Clara said, standing in Marlowe's kitchen and watching Marlowe heat milk on the stove. "About those children." "What kind of questions?" "About whether this is the right place for them. An unmarried woman, well, nobody knows this Voss man from Adam." "I know him well enough," Marlowe said, which was not quite accurate, but accurate in the way that mattered. "The county orphanage is 60 miles away and overcrowded, and those babies are 3 weeks old." Marlowe turned around. She was not a woman who lost her temper visibly, which sometimes made her more frightening to talk to than someone who did. "Clara, those girls survived something I cannot describe to you in civilized company. They are alive because a stranger tied himself to a saddle and rode through the night with one in each arm. They will not be sent to an orphanage while I am standing upright." Clara's mouth worked. "There's also the question of propriety. A single woman on her own property doing something you ought to be ashamed you're not doing yourself." Marlowe turned back to the stove. "Thank you for the sugar." Clara left. Gideon was in the doorway when Marlowe turned around again. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "You didn't have to," he started. "Yes, I did." She handed him one of the babies, the awake one, the one with the watchful eyes that already, 3 days in, seemed to be tracking things with more attention than most infants managed. "Hold her for a minute. I need both hands." He took the baby. He held her the same way he'd held her on the horse, with that deliberate, conscious care, adjusting his grip until she settled. The baby looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them seemed particularly troubled by the arrangement. Marlowe watched this for half a second longer than she intended to. "They need names," Gideon said. "They have names, whatever their parents called them." "Nobody knows what their parents called them." Marlowe turned away and busied herself with the stove. "We can't just start naming them. We're not their family." "No." She stopped. Her hand rested on the edge of the pot and she didn't move it. "No, we're not." The baby in Gideon's arms made a small sound. He adjusted his hold without looking up. Doc Fenner came and pronounced both girls healthy and underweight, but not alarmingly so. He said they were perhaps 3 weeks old, perhaps 4, and that whoever had been feeding them had done it right. He looked at Gideon when he said this last part, and Gideon said nothing. "You've done this before," Fenner said. "Some." Fenner waited, clearly expecting elaboration. None came. He let it go with the pragmatism of a man who had learned not to ask about the histories that showed up in his examination room. After Fenner left, Gideon went out to check the fence line on the north end of the property. Marlowe had mentioned it needed looking at, and he'd offered without being asked, which she'd taken note of without saying anything. She could see him out the window, working steadily along the posts, testing each one before moving to the next. He moved like someone who'd done physical work all his life. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. She was still watching when the baby in the crate, the one who'd been awake, started fussing. Marlowe crossed to her immediately, picked her up, felt the specific weight of her settle against her shoulder. The baby pushed her face against Marlowe's neck in a way that was probably just instinct, just warmth-seeking, but felt like something more specific than that. Marlowe stood at the window with the baby against her shoulder and Gideon outside fixing her fence, and she had a feeling she hadn't had in years. Not quite happiness, not quite hope, something in the uncertain territory between them. She didn't trust it, but she didn't put it down either. On the 5th day, Gideon told her about his family. He didn't mean to. They were sitting at the table after dinner, a late dinner, because the babies had had an unsettled evening and everything had run late. And Marlowe had asked, carefully, why he knew how to hold infants the way he did. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I had a daughter," he said, 4 years ago. Her mother died in childbirth. The baby—" He stopped, started again. "She lived 9 days. Marlowe didn't say she was sorry. It would have been the right thing to say, and it would have been inadequate, and he seemed like a man who found inadequacy worse than silence. After that, he said, I moved a lot. Wasn't any particular reason to stay anywhere. And now you're here. Now I'm here." He looked at the crate across the room, where both babies were finally asleep, their breathing audible in the quiet of the house. Those small, rhythmic sounds that had over 5 days become a kind of background music Marlowe couldn't imagine the house without. "You should know," he said, "that I'm not someone with any claim on a future. I don't have land. I don't have savings worth speaking of. I've been working ranch jobs for 4 years and spending most of what I earn on moving." He looked at her. "I just think you should know that." "Why are you telling me that?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful in the way that said he'd thought about the words before using them. "Because you've been looking at me like I'm someone worth knowing, and you deserve accurate information." Marlowe looked at him for a moment. "Gideon, I'm a 34-year-old widow who runs a 140-acre ranch by herself in the Nebraska Territory. I'm not exactly looking for a man with a portfolio." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something more provisional than a smile. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Outside, the prairie wind moved against the walls of the house, and the babies slept, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence between them was entirely different from any silence that had existed there before. On the 7th day, the telegram came. Mercer sent a writer with it personally, which told Marlowe something about its contents before she'd even unfolded the paper. She read it standing in her yard. Then she read it again. Then she went inside and set it on the table and stood looking at it for a long moment. Gideon came in from outside. He read her face before he read the telegram. "What is it?" "Family," she said. "The sheriff in Omaha found family." He picked up the telegram. She watched him read it, watched his face do that thing it did when he was controlling something, the stillness that wasn't quite neutral, that took effort. "Her sister," he said. "Her name is Vivian Holt. She's coming from Chicago." Marlowe sat down. "She's wealthy, apparently. The telegram says she's very eager to provide for the children." Gideon set the telegram down. He didn't say anything. "She's their family," Marlowe said. The words felt like something being given away. "She's blood. She didn't know Ruth was dead until a week ago. That's not her fault." "No." He sat down across from her. "No, it's not." The baby, the awake one, the watchful one, made a sound from the crate. Both of them looked over. She had somehow maneuvered onto her side and was regarding them with an expression of serene inquiry that seemed, at that particular moment, profoundly unfair. "She'll be here in 4 days," Marlowe said. "I know. The girls will have everything she can give them: education, money, security." "I know. It's the right thing." She wasn't sure she believed it. She was trying to. Gideon looked at the baby for another moment. Then he looked at Marlowe. His gray eyes had something in them that she recognized because she'd felt it herself. The specific expression of someone who has found something they were not looking for and now has to figure out what to do with the having of it. "Marlowe," he said, "don't. I know what you're going to say." She stood up, moved to the stove, needed something to do with her hands. "And I don't want you to say it because if you say it, then I'll have to think about it, and I'm not ready to think about it." He was quiet. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he agreed. And they both went back to taking care of the girls, because there were 4 days left, and they were going to use every one of them. But the days moved the way days do when you are dreading their end, faster than they should, and not fast enough. Gideon fell into the work of the ranch with the quiet efficiency of someone who needed tasks more than he needed conversation. He was up before Marlowe most mornings, had coffee going, had the horses seen to. He took the night feeding on alternate nights without being asked, appearing at the crate at the first sound with the same careful deliberateness he'd shown from the beginning. On the second night, Marlowe woke up and heard him talking to the babies. She lay still and listened. His voice was very low, barely above a murmur, and she couldn't make out the words, just the rhythm of them, the specific quietness of a man talking to someone too young to understand him, saying the things that didn't require understanding. She did not identify, precisely, what happened to her chest during this. She rolled over and stared at the ceiling instead. On the third day, one of the babies laughed. It was brief, a single, bright, unplanned sound, like a small bell dropped accidentally. Both Marlowe and Gideon turned toward it so fast they nearly knocked into each other. The baby, the one who laughed, the awake, watchful one, seemed as surprised by the sound as anyone. She looked up at them both with that expression of serene inquiry and then looked away, apparently finished with the whole business. Gideon and Marlowe looked at each other. "Did she just—" "Yes," Marlowe said. A beat of silence. "Okay," he said. And they both looked away from each other and went back to what they were doing, and neither of them mentioned what had just happened in their faces, and neither of them had to. On the fourth day, a carriage came up the road from town. Marlowe was on the porch. She watched it come. The carriage was finer than anything that usually traveled this road. Dark wood, polished fittings, a driver who held himself very straight. It stopped at her gate, and a woman stepped out, who was immediately and obviously from somewhere that was not Nebraska. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired like her sister had apparently been, based on the description Mercer had shared, dressed in traveling clothes that cost more than Marlowe's monthly operation of the ranch. She looked at the house, at the yard, at the porch, and then her eyes found Marlowe's, and she walked forward with the directness of someone who had not come this far to be careful. "Mrs. Ashby," she said. "Miss Holt." They looked at each other across the fence. Something was being assessed on both sides. I'd like to see them, Vivian Holt said. Her voice was steady and controlled in the way that voices get when they are managing something large and keeping it managed by main force. Come in, Marlowe said. She held the gate. Gideon was inside, in the chair by the crate. He stood when Vivian entered. He was a lot of room to stand in. Broad through the shoulders, a good height, the specific presence of someone who had been outside in weather for most of his adult life. Vivian's eyes went to him briefly, then past him. She crossed to the crate. She looked at the babies for a long time. The awake one looked back at her. Vivian made a sound that was not quite a word, something that came from a different place than words do. Her hand went to the edge of the crate, steadied there. Her chin moved. They look like Ruth, she said. The one with the eyes. She looks just like Ruth. Nobody said anything. Vivian stood there looking at the babies who looked like her dead sister, and the controlled voice and the steady bearing held for about 30 more seconds, and then they didn't. Marlowe moved to the stove and made tea that nobody would probably drink and gave Vivian Holt the space to do what she needed to do, because some things require privacy even when there are other people in the room. Vivian Holt drank the tea after all. She sat at Marlowe's table with both hands wrapped around the tin cup, and her composure reassembled. Not perfectly, the way it had been when she'd walked through the gate, but well enough. The redness around her eyes was there if you looked. Marlowe didn't look directly. Gideon had taken the babies out to the porch, not because anyone asked him to. He'd simply read the room and acted accordingly, gathering both girls with that practiced efficiency of his, and disappearing through the door, and Marlowe had found herself grateful for the fact of him in a way that was becoming inconveniently familiar. "Tell me what happened," Vivian said. "All of it. Not the version the sheriff wrote in a telegram." So Marlowe told her. She kept it factual where she could and honest where she couldn't, and she didn't soften the parts that deserved not to be softened. Vivian listened without interrupting, which was harder than it looked. Marlowe could see the effort of it in the way Vivian's hands tightened periodically around the cup. When Marlowe finished, Vivian was quiet for a moment. "And the man, Voss, he found them. The telegram said he rode through the night. Almost 2 full days without real rest." Vivian looked at the door to the porch. "He didn't have to do that. No. He could have left them somewhere, ridden to town, found someone else to handle it." "Yes." Vivian looked at the door a moment longer. Then she looked back at Marlowe. "Ruth and I didn't speak for 3 years, she said. It came out with the particular tone of something that had been held in a long time and needed air. We argued about... It doesn't matter what we argued about. Something foolish, the way family arguments usually are. I kept thinking there was time to fix it." She stopped. There wasn't. Marlowe didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't either obvious or hollow. "The girls need to come to Chicago," Vivian said. Her voice had returned to its controlled register, but something behind it was different now. Less certain. "They have a future there. I have resources, a household. I can give them everything Ruth would have wanted for them." "I know. You understand that." "I understand that." Marlowe looked at her tin cup. "That doesn't make it simple." Vivian studied her. "You've had them for 7 days." "Yes." "And in 7 days?" "Yes." Marlowe looked up. "I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. You don't have to explain it to me." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Whatever she'd been about to say, she kept it. "I'll need a day or 2 to arrange transport. The carriage isn't suitable for infants over a long journey. I'll need to send for proper supplies from town." She set the cup down. "I'd like to stay close, if that's acceptable. To be with them before we travel." "You can stay here," Marlowe said. Vivian blinked. She hadn't expected that. I couldn't impose." "There's a room. It's not much." Marlowe stood up. "But it's closer to them than the hotel in town, and the road is rough after dark." Vivian looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to categorize, something between gratitude and bewilderment, like someone who'd prepared for a fight and found a door open instead. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Just don't let them cry too long at night. The one with the watchful eyes has a temper." Something crossed Vivian's face that was almost a smile. Ruth had a temper too. Gideon came back inside when the conversation had clearly concluded, with one baby asleep in the crook of his left arm and the other engaged in a detailed examination of his shirt collar. He looked at Vivian. She looked at him. "Miss Holt," he said. "Mr. Voss." She stood. "The sheriff told me what you did. I want you to know." "You don't need to." "I'd like to." He waited. "You gave them back to me," Vivian said. "Whatever else happens, you gave me the chance to know them. I don't have a word for what that is." Gideon looked down at the baby, examining his collar. "They're easy to want to keep alive," he said. "Anybody would have done it." "No," Vivian said quietly. "They wouldn't have." He didn't argue further. He wasn't a man who argued with the truth, even when it made him uncomfortable. The 2 days that followed were strange in the way that borrowed time always is. Vivian turned out to be less ornamental than she appeared. She was awkward with the babies at first, tentative in the way of someone who has no experience with infants and is too aware of this fact to be natural about it. But she was stubborn, and stubbornness in lieu of skill can cover a remarkable amount of ground. By the end of the first day, she had figured out how the awake one liked to be held, sideways, higher than you'd think, with one hand under her head at exactly the right angle, and she'd stopped second-guessing every adjustment. The sleeping one was easier. She slept through most things, and regarded the rest with a placid attention that suggested she'd made a philosophical decision early on not to be upset by circumstances she couldn't control. Marlowe watched Vivian with the babies and felt things she didn't examine too closely. Gideon worked. That was what he did when things were difficult. He found work, and he did it. He fixed the fence on the north end, then the gate latch on the south side that had been sticking for months. He reshingled a section of the barn roof that Marlowe had been meaning to get to. He did it all without discussion, appearing where the need was, disappearing when it was addressed. The ranch had not looked this well tended since her husband was alive. She didn't say this to him. It felt like the kind of observation that would require too many other conversations to be had first. On the second evening, Vivian put both babies to sleep, something that had taken, in the past, a collective effort and significant patience, and came to sit on the porch steps where Marlowe and Gideon were sitting in the cooling dark. She didn't say anything for a while. Neither did they. "I've been thinking," Vivian said finally. "All right," said Marlowe, "about what's right for them. Not what's right for me, or what Ruth would have wanted in some idealized version of things, but actually what's right for these two specific girls who've been through what they've been through." She paused. "And I've been thinking about what they already have." Marlowe didn't move. "They know your voice," Vivian said, not looking at either of them. "They know how you both hold them. They know the sound of this place, the wind against these walls, the way this house smells." She stopped again. "They're 3 weeks old, and they've already learned who's safe." "Vivian," Marlowe said carefully, "I'm not finished." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm also thinking about myself, which is less admirable but probably more honest. I don't know how to raise children. I know how to hire people who do, which is not the same thing, and I know that it's not the same thing." She picked at a thread on her traveling skirt. "Ruth knew. Ruth always knew how to. She was the kind of person who knew instinctively how to be present in a way that I've spent my whole life trying to replicate." The prairie was dark, and the stars were doing what they do in Nebraska, which is appearing in a quantity that feels almost argumentative. "I'm not making a decision tonight," Vivian said. "I want to be clear about that, but I want you both to know that I'm thinking about the right thing, not the expected thing." She stood up. "Good night." She went inside. Marlowe and Gideon sat in the quiet for a while. "She's not what I expected," he said eventually. "No." Marlowe looked at the stars. "Neither were you." I was quiet. She could feel him looking at her, then looking away. "Marlowe." "I know." "No, I don't think you—" "Gideon." She turned to look at him. He was closer than she'd measured, which was its own kind of problem. "I know. Okay? I know what's happening, and I know that it's badly timed, and I know that there's no reasonable version of any of this that ends simply." She stopped. "But I also know that if she takes them, you're going to leave. And I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with that." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of long moment that redraws things. "I don't want to leave," he said. It came out with an honesty that was clearly uncomfortable for him. The specific discomfort of a man who has said something true before he finished deciding whether to say it. Then don't. It's not, Marlo, I've got nothing. I've been telling you that since day one. And I've been telling you since day one that I don't care about that. She turned back to the stars. Her hands were folded in her lap and she was being careful with them. I care about other things. What things? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was matter-of-fact in the way that sometimes means the opposite. I care that you buried two strangers and then carried their daughters across 40 miles of open country. I care that you talk to the babies at 2 in the morning when you think nobody can hear you. I care that you fixed my fence without being asked, and that you knew to take them out to the porch this afternoon so Vivian and I could talk. She stopped. Those are the things I care about. He was very quiet. But that's all I'm saying, she said. Tonight. That's all I'm saying. All right, he said, quietly. All right, she said. Inside, one of the babies made a small sound and then settled. The wind moved across the grass. Neither of them went in immediately, and the space between them on the porch steps was exactly the size it had been all evening, and also entirely different. The trouble from town escalated on the third day of Vivian's stay, and it came in the form of 3 men instead of 1 woman with sugar. Harlan Briggs was the first of them, which told Marlo everything she needed to know about the nature of the visit before the conversation began. Briggs was the kind of man who owned a significant portion of the town's commercial interests and conducted himself accordingly, with the easy authority of someone who had never in his life been told to mind his own business in a way that actually stuck. He was accompanied by 2 members of the county council whose names Marlo knew and whose opinions she found consistently uninteresting. They arrived while Gideon was in town giving his formal identification statement to Mercer, something they had perhaps known in advance. Marlo met them at the gate. Mrs. Ashby, Briggs said, with the warmth of a man who has calculated the precise amount of warmth required. We've come to discuss a matter of community concern. The children, Marlo said, specifically the arrangement here. An unmarried woman, an unknown man. It's irregular. The man is a witness in an active murder investigation living temporarily on my property while he assists the sheriff. Miss Holt, the children's blood relation from Chicago, is also here. What exactly is irregular? One of the council members cleared his throat. Mrs. Ashby, the concern is about precedent. About what kind of precedent for what? A woman choosing who stays on her own land? She looked at him steadily. That precedent has already been set. It was set when I bought this property in my own name 4 years ago. You were at the land office when I signed the papers, Mr. Dunnett. I believe you shook my hand. Dunnett had the grace to look uncomfortable. Briggs tried a different approach. The children would be better served. The children are being served very well, thank you. Marlo opened the gate, which was a gesture that could be read as either invitation or conclusion. She meant it as conclusion. If you have concerns about criminal activity, the sheriff's office is on Main Street. If you have concerns about my property management, you can file a complaint with the county, which will be reviewed sometime before the winter of next year, I imagine. Good afternoon. Briggs looked at the open gate. His face moved through several expressions, settling on something controlled and unpleasant. This isn't finished, Mrs. Ashby. Most things aren't. She held the gate. Good afternoon, Harlan. He left. The council members followed because that was what they did. Marlo closed the gate and stood for a moment with both hands on the latch, and she breathed carefully, and she waited for whatever was churning in her chest to settle back down into something manageable. Vivian was in the doorway when she turned around. She had clearly heard the entire exchange. Does that happen often? She asked. It happens. What does he want, specifically? Marlo walked back to the house. He wants things to be orderly. He wants what he considers disorder to sort itself out in a way that confirms what he already believes about what women can and can't manage. She went inside. He wants the babies placed somewhere official so they stop being a question mark in his county, and he wants Gideon gone because Gideon doesn't fit any category he can file. Vivian followed her inside. And you? And me he's been waiting on for 4 years, ever since I didn't sell the ranch and leave after Thomas died. Marlo picked up the awake baby, who had been regarding the ceiling with focused attention and seemed unsurprised to be picked up. He'll wait longer. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I want to understand something, she said, and I'm asking it plainly because I think you'd rather have plainness than careful phrasing. Generally, do you want to keep them? The girls. Marlo held the baby against her shoulder. She felt the small breathing, the warmth, the minute adjustments of a body finding its most comfortable position. She thought about the honest answer, which was not the simple answer. Yes, she said. I want to keep them. I know every reason why that's complicated, and I know it may not be possible, and I know that you're their family and I'm not. She looked at Vivian. But you asked me to be plain. Vivian nodded slowly. Something in her face was working through a calculation that Marlo couldn't entirely see. And Gideon, Vivian said, what does he want? You'd have to ask him. I'm asking you. Marlo looked at the baby. He wants the same thing I want. He just hasn't said it in as many words. She shifted the baby to her other shoulder. He lost a daughter 4 years ago, before that the child's mother. He's been walking around since then like a man living on borrowed time that nobody's calling in. She stopped. And then he found these two, and walked into this. And now he's fixing my fence and talking to them at 2 a.m. and trying to convince himself he's a temporary arrangement. Vivian was very quiet. He's not a temporary arrangement, Marlo said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud. It felt like setting something heavy down, a relief and a weight simultaneously. I don't know what to do about that yet. Gideon came back from town in the late afternoon with his jaw set in a particular way that Marlo had learned to read. She waited until Vivian had taken the babies for their evening feeding before she asked, "What happened at Mercer's?" He sat down. He was still wearing his coat, which meant he hadn't fully decided to be home yet, in whatever way his mind counted things as home. I gave my statement, identified the men I saw. He looked at the table. One of them's been seen east of here, within 30 miles. Marlo sat down across from him. Mercer's handling it? He's trying to. He's got 2 deputies in a county that's twice the size it should be for that head count. His jaw moved. They moved on the Calloway family because they knew they were carrying money, which means they had information from somewhere, so somebody told them. Mercer's looking into who? How long until he can move? He needs a larger posse. Could be a week. Could be less if he can get volunteer riders. He looked up. They might hear that there's a witness and run, or they might not. The word might sat in the room. Gideon, Marlo said. I'm not going after them, he said. Before you say it, I'm not going after them alone. Mercer has it. She looked at him. I'm not, he said again. He didn't quite meet her eyes. All right, she said. But the way she said it was a question, and he knew it, and neither of them pushed it further. That night, Marlo woke to the sound of the awake baby crying. It wasn't the fussing sound, the tentative preliminary to real distress. It was the real thing, the full-throated, no-patience-left cry that demanded immediate response. Marlo was up before she'd fully finished waking, crossing the room in the dark with the automatic competence of someone who had been doing this for 9 days and whose body had reorganized itself accordingly. She got to the crate and found Gideon already there. He had the crying baby. The other one was still asleep, a feat of soundproofing that continued to astonish. Gideon was standing in the dark, holding the crying girl against his shoulder, moving in the slight rhythmic way that he'd figured out on the second day calmed her faster than anything else. He hadn't lit the lamp. Marlo stood in the doorway and watched. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. He was standing in a dark room with a crying baby, and he was tired. She could see the tiredness in his posture, the particular sag of a man who has been running on short sleep for too many consecutive days. He hadn't heard her yet. He was just there, present the way that doesn't require anything from anyone else. The baby's crying had already dropped to a lower register, not quite settled, getting there. I've got her, Marlo said quietly. He turned. She woke up fast. I didn't want her to wake the other one. I know, Marlo crossed to him. I've got her. He transferred the baby to her with the practiced care of a handoff. They had done a dozen times. The baby turned her face toward Marlo's neck in that specific searching way and immediately began the process of deciding whether this was acceptable. Apparently it was. The crying settled further. Gideon didn't go back to the cot. He stood for a moment, watching, making sure. Go back to sleep, Marlo said. I'm fine. You look terrible. Thank you. Gideon. She looked at him over the top of the baby's head. Go back to sleep. I have her. He looked at her for a moment, looked at the baby, made the calculation that this was in fact adequately handled. Wake me if the other one, I will. He went back to the cot. She stayed with the baby, moving in that slow rhythm, listening to the house settle around her, the sounds of sleeping people, the wind outside, the grass moving. 2 people and 2 babies in a house that had felt empty for 4 years. She didn't let herself finish that thought. She just kept moving. On the 4th morning, the second piece of news arrived, and this one didn't come through a telegram. It came through the door in the form of a man Marlowe had never seen before, arriving on a horse that had been ridden hard, asking for Mercer, but settling for Gideon when Mercer wasn't there. His name was Tidwell, he said. He worked a ranch 12 miles east. He'd seen men matching the description of the outlaw gang. 4 of them, or 3, hard to say, camped near the creek bed on his eastern border. He'd ridden straight to town to tell the sheriff and found the sheriff out. He'd gone to the deputy. The deputy had taken note and said he'd send word. He didn't seem in a hurry, Tidwell said. He was a weathered man, somewhere in his 60s, with the directness of someone who had a long ride back and didn't want to waste what was already spent. Figured I'd rather find someone who'd act on it. He looked at Gideon when he said this. Gideon looked back at him. How long ago did you see them? Gideon asked. Sundown last night. They still there this morning? Smoke was still coming up when I left. Gideon was quiet. His hands were relaxed on the table, which was, Marlowe had learned, the specific stillness of a man whose mind was moving fast behind a still face. You said the deputy took note, he said. Said he'd send word to the sheriff. Mercer's out on the Eastern Circuit today, I think, some dispute about a property line. When does he come back? Tomorrow, maybe, day after. Gideon nodded slowly. He was still looking at his hands. Marlowe watched him from across the room. Mr. Tidwell, she said, can we get you some water before you head back? She got Tidwell his water, walked him to his horse, thanked him for coming. Then she went back inside. Gideon was still at the table. She sat down across from him. She didn't say anything. She waited. He looked up. His gray eyes had the quality they got when he was doing something internal that didn't show cleanly on the surface. I'm not going after them, he said. You said that last night. I'm saying it again. You're also thinking about them moving on before Mercer gets back. You're thinking about how they've been operating in this county for 2 years and never gotten close to caught. You're thinking about the Calloway family and about those 2 girls in the other room. His jaw tightened slightly. I know what you're thinking, she said, because I know what I'd be thinking. Marlowe, I'm not asking you to stay. The words cost her something. She said them anyway because they were true. I'm not going to be the thing that ties your hands when you believe you need to act. That's not who I want to be. She looked at him. But I need you to know that if you go, you don't go recklessly. You go smart. You go with enough information, and you don't do something that gets you killed over a principle. He looked at her for a long time. I hear you, he said. That's not the same as agreeing. No. He stood up. It's not. He went outside. She heard him at the barn, heard the horse. Vivian appeared in the doorway, holding the sleeping baby. She looked at Marlowe. He's going. I think so. You didn't stop him. No. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Do you think he can? I don't know. Marlowe looked at the door. I think he's the kind of man who does what he decides to do, and I think he's decided. She looked at Vivian. I also think he's been carrying this since the minute he found those girls. Maybe longer. She stood up. Watch the other one. I'll be right back. She went outside. Gideon had the horse saddled and was checking the cinch with the focused attention of a man trying not to look at someone approaching. Gideon. He turned. She crossed to him. She stopped close enough that looking away would have required effort. She looked at him directly. The gray eyes, the jaw that hadn't been properly shaved again, the face of a man who had ridden through 2 days of Nebraska wilderness, carrying someone else's children because it was the right thing to do. Come back, she said. It was not a long speech. It was not eloquent. It was 3 words that carried everything she hadn't said on the porch steps, in the kitchen, in the dark room at 2 in the morning. He looked at her. "I'll come back," he said. She took one step back, gave him the space he needed. "Then go do what you need to do." He mounted up. He looked down at her once, a long, steady look that said several things without saying any of them. And then he turned the horse and rode east, and Marlowe stood in the yard and watched him until the prairie folded him in and he was gone. She stood there for a moment longer after that. Then she went back inside where Vivian was holding one sleeping baby and the other was beginning to wake up, and there was work to be done, and she did it, and she did not look toward the east again for the rest of that day, because looking didn't help anything, and she needed her hands steady. The hours after Gideon rode east had a particular quality to them that Marlowe recognized from other bad days in her life. The way time gets thick, the way ordinary tasks feel like things being done by someone slightly removed from yourself, hands moving on their own while the rest of you is somewhere else entirely. She fed the babies, she heated water, she mended a section of fence cloth that had been bothering her for a week. She did all of it with competence and very little awareness, and she did not look toward the east road, and she did not say to Vivian what she was thinking, because saying it would have made it more real than she wanted it to be. Vivian, to her credit, didn't press. She had turned out to be a woman who understood something about the usefulness of silence, which was the quality Marlowe respected most in another person after honesty. The afternoon moved. The babies slept in shifts, which was their current preference, one awake and inquiring while the other rested, so that there was never a moment when both were simultaneously occupied with being unconscious. The watchful one had developed a habit of staring at whoever was holding her with an intensity that felt evaluative, like she was reaching conclusions that she would share in several years when she had the vocabulary for them. Marlowe was sitting with her when Vivian came and sat across and said, without preamble, "Tell me about your husband." Marlowe looked up. It wasn't a question she'd expected. "Thomas," she said. "Why?" "Because you've been in this house alone for 4 years and you're still here, and I'm trying to understand you." Vivian's voice wasn't intrusive. It was direct in the way of someone who had decided that careful approaches were a waste of time they didn't have. "You don't have to answer." Marlowe looked at the baby in her arms. Thomas was a good man, not a dramatic man, not the kind of man who made big gestures or said large things. He built this ranch from a claim he filed when he was 22 years old. He worked it until he died. She stopped. He wanted children. We both did. It didn't happen. She shifted the baby slightly. When he died, everyone expected me to sell. Go back to my family in Illinois. Start over somewhere smaller. She looked at Vivian. I couldn't. This was the place he built. It felt wrong to give it away. So you stayed. So I stayed. Vivian was quiet a moment. And now there's Gideon. There's Gideon. What are you going to do about that? I don't know yet. She looked at the baby. Ask me when he comes back. She said it the way people say things they mean as conditions, not certainties. Ask me when, not ask me if. And she noted her own phrasing and decided not to correct it, because correcting it would mean admitting something she was still holding at arm's length. Outside, the prairie held its color through the long afternoon, and the east road was empty, and Marlowe kept her hands busy. Gideon had not intended to do what he did. That was the honest version of it, and he was, whatever his flaws, a man who generally defaulted to honest versions of things, even when they made him look worse. He'd ridden east with the intention of finding the camp Tidwell had described, and sitting on a ridge somewhere with a clear sightline, watching long enough to confirm they were still there, then riding back to find Mercer and give him an exact location. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. It did not require him to do anything except observe. The problem was the body. He found it half a mile before he found the camp. A man, face down in the creek bed, dead perhaps 3 hours. The man was wearing a deputy's badge, young, maybe 25, with dark hair, and the particular stillness of someone for whom stillness had become permanent. Gideon stopped his horse and looked at the body for a long time. The creek made its sounds. The trees moved. He looked at the badge, at the way the man was positioned, the angle of it, the direction he'd been coming from. And he understood what had happened. The deputy had gotten Tidwell's information and decided not to wait after all. He'd ridden out ahead of everyone else, which was exactly what you didn't do when you were tracking men who killed without announcement. Gideon got down from his horse. He didn't think about what he was doing next in any articulate way. Thinking in articulate ways had not always served him well in the moments when things needed to happen. He checked his rifle. He checked his revolver. He checked the lay of the land between him and the smoke he could now see rising through the trees. He had, he calculated, perhaps 3 hours of daylight. I thought about Marlowe saying, "Come back," and he thought about the Calloway family, and he thought about the deputy's badge lying in the creek bed, and then he stopped thinking and started moving. The camp was set in a natural depression along the creek bend. A good choice, tactically, because it was sheltered on 3 sides and provided water access without exposure. 3 men visible. A fourth, he knew from the description, which meant one was somewhere he couldn't see. That was the variable that mattered. You could work around 3 known positions. One unknown position was a different problem. He found a ridgeline that gave him the 3 and kept him in the shadow of a rocky overhang that had enough brush around it to break his silhouette. He watched. He waited. He cataloged what he saw: the horses, the fire, the bedrolls, the saddlebags stacked near the largest tree, the specific way these men moved around each other, which told him about hierarchy and attention and who would react first to what. The leader was the largest one. He had a stillness about him that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of someone who had decided a long time ago that most things were acceptable to him, and that particular decision had left nothing to be restless about. He sat with his back to the largest tree, and he watched the other 2 with the same evaluative attention that the babies had, and that, in a baby, was touching, and in this man was something else entirely. Gideon recognized him. He'd known he would. He'd seen enough of the man's face in the dark of the Calloway massacre scene, seen it in the specific way you see things you are trying to commit to memory against the future need of having them, to place him now in the better light of late afternoon. His name, Mercer had told him, was Cord Dalloway. He had a history in 3 states and a reputation that had made the law in 2 of those states content to let him become someone else's problem. I was currently, Gideon noted, someone's problem. The 4th man appeared from the trees to the south, carrying a bucket of creek water. Gideon adjusted his read of the positions and spent another 10 minutes confirming what he had, and then he made the decision that he'd been making incrementally since he'd found the deputy in the creek bed, the decision that had been assembling itself piece by piece without his authorization. He was going to hold them here, not take them. He wasn't that ambitious or that foolish. But Mercer was somewhere on the Eastern Circuit, and if Gideon rode back to find him and came back with a posse, the camp would be cold. These men moved. They'd been moving for 2 years ahead of everything that tried to catch up with them. One more night, and they would be gone, and the Calloway family would be unavenged, and the deputy in the creek bed would be unavenged, and those 2 girls in Marlowe's house would grow up in a world where the men who made them orphans were still in it and still moving. He couldn't make that acceptable. He'd tried, and he couldn't. So he set himself on the ridge, and he fired the first shot at the base of the tree nearest the horses, not to hit anyone, but to scatter the horses and take away the easiest exit, and then things moved very fast. What followed was not clean. Gideon had been in situations involving gunfire before, enough to know that the version in people's stories afterward is always tidier than the version that's actually happening. In the actual version, everything is noise and dust and the particular sharp clarity of understanding that each second has a consequence attached to it. Dalloway's men were fast. He'd expected that. They scattered from the fire, using the terrain they knew, and he was still mapping, and the next 10 minutes were the kind of minutes that compress strangely in memory. Too quick in some places, stretched nearly still in others. He took one of them out of the equation early. A shot from the ridge that caught the man in the shoulder and dropped him behind a rock, where he stayed making noise but not shooting back. That was the best outcome available for that man, and Gideon didn't spend mental energy on it. Dalloway himself was the problem. He was smart, and he was experienced, and he didn't panic, which meant he used the terrain instead of running from it. And he and Gideon spent a period of time that felt much longer than it probably was in a calculation game about angles and cover and patience. Dalloway was trying to get around to Gideon's left, which would take him to a position that negated the ridge advantage. Gideon knew this and adjusted, and the adjustment cost him. He moved from cover to cut off the angle, and in the moving, the 4th man, who had been working around the south side, got a shot through. It hit him in the left side. Not the same place as before, lower and harder, with the immediate sensation of something structural having gone wrong, a different kind of hurt than the knife cut. Something that announced itself with authority and didn't plan to quiet down. He went down to one knee. He did not go down all the way. He found the fourth man against the tree line, and he ended that problem. He found Dalloway, who had paused at the sound of the shot, had paused and was tracking, intelligent and lethal. And they looked at each other across roughly 40 yards of creek-bottom terrain, and Gideon was bleeding through his coat and his knee was in the dirt, and he looked back at Dalloway with the specific expression of a man who has decided that this is going to go however it goes. He heard the horses before he understood what they meant. Then he understood. Mercer. Mercer's voice calling out positions. Mercer's voice, which meant Mercer had gotten word somehow, had cut his circuit short or been reached by a rider, had come east with 4 deputies instead of 2, and arrived at the exact moment that the situation had reached its particular crisis point. Dalloway ran. He got 12 feet before 2 of Mercer's deputies cut off the exit, and then he stopped. And the calculation he made in that moment, the rapid, visible calculation of a man measuring odds, reached its conclusion, and he put his hands up. The man behind the rock was still making noise. He put his hands up when asked. The one Gideon had hit with the first shot from the ridge was alive and furious and thoroughly caught. The fourth was not a problem anymore. Mercer found Gideon still on one knee in the dirt, one hand pressed against his side and the other still holding his rifle, and he said, with the measured tone of a man who was going to have a lot of feelings about this later, "Voss. Mercer. You're shot." "Yes." "You rode out here alone." "I found your deputy in the creek bed." Gideon looked at him. "I wasn't going to wait." Mercer looked at him for a long moment. He was doing the specific thing he did when he was running through all the things he wanted to say and selecting the ones that were useful. "Can you ride?" "I can ride." "Can you ride 12 miles? Gideon tested his legs. The answer was not obviously yes. "I can ride far enough for you to get a wagon." Mercer made a sound that was not quite language. He turned and called to one of his deputies. He turned back. "The saddlebags." "We got the saddlebags. There's documentation in there, papers from the Calloway family, correspondence, enough to put these men away for what they did." "Good," Gideon said. "Is that all you've got to say?" "What else do you want me to say?" "I want you to say you're not going to bleed to death before we get you to Doc Fenner." Gideon thought about Marlowe saying come back. He thought about it with the specific intensity of a man who has something to come back to. "I'm not going to bleed to death," he said. He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he said it because it was the only acceptable answer. The rider reached the Ashby Ranch as the last light was flattening out across the prairie, and Marlowe knew before he even reached the gate that it was news, because of the pace and because of the way he held himself in the saddle. The particular tension of someone carrying something that has weight. She was already off the porch and at the gate by the time he pulled up. "Mrs. Ashby." He was one of Mercer's younger deputies. She knew his face, not his name. "The sheriff sent me. There was... Mr. Voss rode out after the gang." Her hands tightened on the gate. "Is he alive?" "Yes, ma'am. He's shot. Not gravely, the sheriff thinks, but he's going to need the doctor tonight. Mercer's got him on a wagon heading back to town." "They got the gang?" "Yes, ma'am. All 4 accounted for. They found evidence in the saddlebags. Enough for charges on the Calloway murders." She heard all of this. She processed it in the background of the one thing that mattered at this specific moment. "How bad is the wound?" "Left side. The sheriff said he lost blood, but he was coherent when they loaded him up. He was arguing with the sheriff about it, which the sheriff said was a good sign." She almost laughed. "It came out wrong. Too sharp, too close to something else. Tell Mercer I'll be in town within the hour." "Yes, ma'am." He rode back. Marlowe stood at the gate for a moment, hands still on the latch, feeling something move through her chest that had too many components to name individually. She went inside. Vivian was standing in the middle of the room. She'd heard enough. "Go," she said before Marlowe could speak. "I've got them." "Vivian, I've been doing this for 4 days." Vivian's voice was steady. "I know which one doesn't like being put down too fast, and I know how to do the cloth feeding, and I know where you keep the extra blankets. Go." Marlowe looked at her, looked at the babies, the watchful one and the calm one, settled in their crate in the lamplight. "I'll be back by morning," she said. "I know." Vivienne picked up the watchful one, who had already begun to register the change in atmosphere with her characteristic alert attention. Go take care of your cowboy. Marlowe went. The ride to town was 12 miles, and she did it in under an hour, which required asking more of her horse than was polite. And she arrived in Harlan in the dark with her hair half out of its pins and her coat dusty from the road. Mercer was on the steps of Doc Fenner's office. He's inside, he said. Fenner's working. How bad? Bad enough that it needed work. Not bad enough to stop him from telling me exactly how I should have positioned my deputies at the creek bend. Mercer looked at her with the expression of a man who has been through a significant evening and is only now beginning to sort out his feelings about it. He's going to be all right, Mrs. Ashby. She let out a breath. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief implies the danger is past, and nothing about the next hours or days was past yet. It was something smaller, a single thread going slack. Can I go in? Fenner's almost done. 5 minutes. She sat on the steps beside Mercer, and they said nothing for a moment, and the town moved around them at its nighttime pace, quieter and slower, but not still. He found my deputy, Mercer said. Aldred. He was 23 years old. He went out without telling anyone because he was young, and he thought he was faster than the situation. His voice was flat in the way that flatness means the opposite. Voss found him, and he made a choice. A reckless one. Yes. Mercer paused. Also the only one that was going to work. If he'd come back to find me, they'd have been gone. We'd have had cold tracks and cold ashes, and 2 years more of the same. He looked at his hands. I'm going to be officially displeased about his methods. On record. Formally. Understood. Unofficially. He paused. It's done. The papers in the saddlebags are enough for a full case. The circuit judge will have what he needs. He looked at her. Those girls have justice now. Whatever else happens, they have that. Marlowe looked at the door to Fenner's office. Whatever else happens, she said. Mercer looked at her. He was a careful man, Elias, and he'd known Marlowe Ashby for 4 years, and he'd watched her run a ranch alone and handle Harlan Briggs, and take in 2 orphaned infants without a full night's sleep, and he said, with the bluntness of someone who has given up on careful phrasing, He's a good man, Mrs. Ashby, reckless, but good. I know that. I'm just saying. Elias. I know. He nodded, stood up. 5 minutes, he repeated, and went back inside. She sat on the steps in the dark and she waited, which was something she'd been doing all day and which did not get easier with practice. Doc Fenner's back room smelled of carbolic and lamp oil and the specific clean, harsh smell of medical work. There was a cot against the wall, and Gideon was on it, and he was awake, which was the first thing she confirmed before she let herself look at anything else. He was pale in the way that blood loss makes people pale, a grayness under the skin, the color of someone who has spent several hours at a considerable deficit. His shirt had been cut away on the left side. There were bandages, white and already showing some stain but holding. His eyes were open and they tracked to her immediately when she came through the door. I know, he said. You don't know anything yet. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside the cot. She did not take his hand, which she wanted to do, because she needed to be angry first. You said you weren't going alone. I said I wasn't going after them alone. I went to observe. And then you found the deputy. Yes. And then you stopped observing. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I couldn't leave it, Marlowe. You understand that. She did understand it. She understood it completely, which was the inconvenient part. You could have died. I was aware of that. Out there alone with nobody knowing where you were, Mercer figured it out. He cut his circuit and came east. He paused. I didn't plan on Mercer, but Mercer's good at his job. You don't get to give Mercer credit for the fact that you're still alive. No, he agreed. Probably not. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The lamp between them was low and the room was quiet, and outside she could hear the sounds of the town at night, ordinary and indifferent. They got the documentation, she said. I know. Mercer told me. The girls have justice. Something moved across his face. Yes. Was that the whole reason? He was quiet for a moment. Mostly. Some of it was... He stopped, started over. When I found that deputy, when I understood what had happened to him. He was young. He was young, and he went out alone because nobody had taught him yet that wanting to do the right thing isn't the same as being ready to do it. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something raw under the control. I kept thinking about how he had probably someone too, somewhere, someone waiting. She was quiet. I didn't want to be another version of that story, he said, but I also couldn't be the version where I rode away and they moved on and none of it ever. He stopped. His jaw tightened. It's not rational. It's not irrational either. I told you I'd come back. You did. I came back. You came back on a wagon bleeding through your coat. That's not quite the comeback I had in mind. He looked at her for a long moment. What version did you have in mind? She looked at her hands. She looked at the bandages. She looked at his face, which was tired and pale, and too honest with her right now to manage any kind of deflection. Upright would have been preferable, she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Closer than usual. I'll work on that. Gideon. She stopped. She'd said his name without knowing what was coming after it, and now she had to decide. When you're better. When Fenner clears you. I want you to come back to the ranch. He was very still. I'm not asking you to fix fences. I'm asking you to... She stopped again. This was harder than she'd anticipated, which was its own information. I'm asking you to come home, if that's something you want. The word home went into the room and stayed. He looked at her for a long time. What about the girls? I don't know yet. Vivian's still deciding, but whatever she decides, she looked at him. Whatever she decides, I want you there. Not as a temporary arrangement, not as someone with nowhere else to be. She held his gaze. I want you there because you want to be there. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was careful in the way it had been on the porch, the night of the stars, and the barely said things. I've wanted to be there since about day 3, he said. I just didn't think I had the right to want it. You have the right. She reached out then, finally, and put her hand over his. His hand was warm, which she registered with a specific relief because cold hands meant circulation problems, and he'd lost blood. You have the right. His hand turned under hers and held it. They sat in Fenner's back room in the lamplight, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the holding was enough. And the town went on outside, and somewhere 12 miles west, 2 babies were sleeping in a wooden crate lined with soft blankets, while a woman from Chicago, who was learning how to be present, sat nearby and watched over them. Mercer appeared in the doorway after a while with a look on his face that was trying to be professional. I'm going to need a formal statement tomorrow, he said to Gideon, when you're in a condition to give one. Tomorrow, Gideon said. Mercer looked at Marlowe. He looked at their hands, which were still together on the edge of the cot. He made no comment about this, which was one of his better qualities. Fenner says he can move to the hotel tomorrow if he's stable overnight. He'll need a week at minimum before he's riding. He paused. I'll post a deputy at the jail. Those men aren't going anywhere. Thank you, Elias, Marlowe said. He nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. Voss, what you did today was... He stopped, started over. I'm going to have to say it was reckless and poorly coordinated, and you should have found me first. I know. I'm going to have to say that officially. I know. The deputy's family is going to want answers about what happened out there. I'm going to need your account to be thorough. It will be. Mercer nodded again. He looked at the ceiling briefly, the way men do when they're making room for something. Those saddlebags also had items from 3 other robberies, 3 other families. He looked at Gideon. You ended 2 years of this tonight. He left before Gideon could respond to that. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He's going to cite me formally and then tell everyone in town I did the right thing. Yes, Marlowe said. That's how Elias works. I can live with that. Good. She looked at him. How's the pain? Manageable. He paused. Fenner gave me something. It's making it harder to think clearly. Then stop thinking clearly. Sleep. You should go back. The girls... Vivian has them. She said she did and she meant it. Marlowe settled in the chair, which was not comfortable, which she had already decided to ignore. I'm staying until morning. He looked at her. You don't have to... Gideon. She looked back at him, steady. Sleep. He closed his eyes. His hand was still in hers. His breathing, over the next 10 minutes, changed into the specific rhythm of someone not fighting anymore. And Marlowe sat in the chair beside the cot through the long hours of the night, and she held on, and the lamp burned down low, and she stayed. Outside, Harlan County was dark and quiet, and the jail at the end of Main Street held 4 men who would not be moving on again. And the papers in Mercer's office would go to a circuit judge and then to a court. And 2 small girls 12 miles west would wake in the morning not knowing any of this, not knowing that the night had settled something that had been unsettled since the moment they'd been hidden under a wagon floor and the world had gone silent above them. They would learn it later in the way children learn the shape of their own stories, slowly, in pieces, from the people who loved them enough to carry it forward. But that was later. Tonight, Marlowe held Gideon's hand in the low lamplight of a doctor's back room, and she did not sleep, and she did not need to, because the man she'd asked to come home was breathing steadily beside her, and that was enough for one night. I was not a good patient. Marlowe had suspected this, in the abstract way you suspect things about people before you have direct evidence. She had not anticipated the full specific texture of it, the way Gideon approached bed rest with the focused resentment of a man who considered stillness a personal failing, the way he argued with Doc Fenner about timelines using the particular logic of someone who has decided the conclusion first and is building the reasoning backward. 3 days, Fenner said, on the morning of the second day. The wound's clean, Gideon said. You said so yourself. The wound is clean because you haven't moved around enough to tear it open again. That's not the same as healed. I can move carefully. You can sit in that bed carefully. Fenner pointed at the mattress with the authority of a man who had been overruled by patients before and had reached the point in his career where he was not interested in doing it graciously. You're not riding, you're not lifting, you are staying horizontal for the remainder of today and most of tomorrow, and then we'll discuss what carefully means. Gideon looked at Marlowe. She looked back at him with an expression that said she was not going to be recruited into this argument on his side. She agrees with me, Fenner said, without looking at her. Ask her yourself. I wasn't going to. You were about to, Marlowe said. The answer is no. Stay in the bed. Gideon stayed in the bed. He did it with the grace of a man swallowing something that tastes bad, which was about as much as anyone could reasonably expect. Marlowe had ridden back to the ranch at dawn, checked on the babies and on Vivienne, both adequately cared for, the watchful one conducting her morning evaluation of the ceiling, while the calm one slept with her characteristic philosophical indifference to circumstance, and then ridden back to town with clean clothes for Gideon and a tin of the coffee that Fenner's household apparently didn't run to. She did this without examining it too closely, because examining things too closely had a way of slowing you down when speed was what was needed. Gideon drank the coffee with the specific relief of a man who had been managing on something unacceptable and was too polite to say so. He looked better than he had the night before, color returning, the grayness retreating, but he moved with a deliberateness that acknowledged something had happened to his body, whether or not he planned to discuss it. Mercer came by this morning, he said. He told me. He said you gave a full statement. Everything I could remember. He's sending it to the territorial judge along with the papers from the saddlebags. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup. He identified the 3 other families from the other robberies. 2 of them had surviving relatives. That's something. It's something. He was quiet for a moment. Aldred's family is in Omaha. Mercer's writing to them. Marlowe looked at the window. The deputy had been 23 years old. She didn't say anything about that because there wasn't anything to say that would make it proportionate to its weight. It's not your fault, she said. I know. Gideon? I know, he said again. He said it differently the second time, less defensive, more like a man saying something he was trying to believe accurately. I know it's not. He made his choice and I made mine, and the men who put both of us out there made theirs. He looked at his hands. I keep seeing him and thinking about what he thought he was riding into, whether he thought he had it managed. You can't know that. No. He looked up. How are the girls? She recognized the shift for what it was. Not avoidance exactly, more like the move a man makes when he's stood in one uncomfortable place as long as he can and needs to step to a different one. They're fine. Vivienne managed the night. She managed the night? Better than I expected. She's got the feeding sorted out, and she figured out that the calm one likes being slightly elevated. You know how she always tries to tuck her chin down on your shoulder? Vivian propped a folded blanket under the crate padding, and she slept 3 hours straight. Something moved on his face. Interest, and something warmer than interest. Nobody had figured that out yet. Nobody had tried that specific thing, apparently. Vivian is very systematic when she wants to be. He was quiet. She staying longer? She hasn't said. Marlo looked at her own hands. She said she's thinking. She's been thinking since she got here. Yes, Marlo paused. She's thinking about the right thing, which means it's taking a while because the right thing isn't simple. She looked at him. She's not her sister's absence. She's her own person making her own calculation. I've been trying to remember that. Gideon looked at her steadily. You think she's going to leave them? I think she might. She said it with the flatness of someone who has spent the night making peace with a possibility. I think she came here expecting to collect her nieces and discovered something she didn't expect, and now she's trying to figure out what love actually requires instead of what she assumed it would require. She stopped. That's not a small thing to work through. No, he agreed. It's not. They sat in the quiet of Fenner's room, and the morning went on outside, and neither of them filled the silence, because the silence was already full of things that didn't need words yet. On the third day, Fenner released him to the hotel with conditions: no riding, no lifting, wound checked daily, any fever reported immediately. Gideon accepted these terms with the compliance of a man who had run out of energy for the other option. He was in the hotel's ground floor room, propped against the headboard with the window open to the afternoon air, when Vivian arrived. Marlo had gone back to the ranch by then. Gideon hadn't been expecting visitors specifically, and Vivian's knock was so precise and formal that he'd assumed it was Mercer before she opened the door. She came in and sat in the room's single chair and looked at him with the directness she'd shown since the first day. I've made a decision, she said. He waited. I'd like to tell you and Marlo together, but I wanted to speak to you first, separately. She set her hands on her knees. Because you're the variable I understand least. All right? Marlo I can read. She's transparent in the way of someone who's never had to perform anything. What she is, she shows. But you, she paused. You showed up with 2 babies on a horse, and you've been here nearly 2 weeks, and I still don't know what you want. I think Marlo told you what I want. She told me what she believes. I'd like to hear it from you. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the hotel's main room had its steady afternoon noise, chairs, voices, the particular clatter of a busy establishment. What specifically are you asking? Are you staying? Not because circumstances trapped you here, not because you feel responsible. Are you staying because you want to be here, with her, on that ranch, for the duration? He looked at her. Yes. You understand what that means. She's not a simple situation. The ranch, the community, 2 children if I... She stopped. There are people in this town who will make it difficult. There's a man named Briggs who's already made his position clear. I know about Briggs. He has influence. He has money and habit. Those aren't always the same as influence. Gideon shifted carefully, adjusting his position against the headboard. Vivian, I have been moving my whole life for 4 years because I was trying to find a reason to stop. I didn't plan on Marlo. I didn't plan on the girls. But here's the thing about not planning something. It turns out to matter more than the things you plan sometimes. Because you don't plan things that aren't real. You plan things you're managing from a distance. Vivian was quiet. I'm staying, he said. That's the answer. However complicated the rest of it is, that's fixed. She looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring, she seemed to find it in order. All right. She stood. Then I'll tell you both together. Tomorrow, when Marlo comes. She left. He sat in the afternoon quiet and looked at the ceiling and felt, underneath the specific ache of the wound and the accumulated exhaustion of the past weeks, something that had been absent for 4 years. The particular sensation of being in a place that had his name on it, whether or not the papers said so yet. Marlo arrived the next morning with the babies. She hadn't planned to bring them, had planned to leave them with the woman who helped at the general store, who had offered twice. But the watchful one had been fussy since dawn, and the calm one had seemed, in her philosophical way, to prefer company, and Marlowe had made the decision that being at Gideon's bedside was probably better for everyone than being at the general store. She arrived at the hotel with one baby in each arm and her hair in a practical braid and the specific expression of someone who has been awake since 5 in the morning and is operating on competence rather than rest. Vivian was already there. Gideon was sitting up in the room's chair. Fenner had cleared him for sitting marginally. And when Marlowe came through the door with the babies, something happened to his face that he didn't try to control. He reached out, and the watchful one went to him with the immediate calm that she reserved specifically for him, settling against his good shoulder with her habitual air of having arrived somewhere she intended to be. "Careful," Marlowe said automatically. "I know." He adjusted the baby away from his left side. "I know." Marlowe sat on the edge of the bed with the calm one. Vivian stood by the window. There was a moment where everyone in the room was simply there, in the particular late morning light, and nobody said anything, and the babies made their small sounds, and the room had the specific quality of a moment that all 4 adults present understood was about to change something permanently. Vivian spoke first. "I'm not taking them," she said. The room was quiet. "I want to be precise about this," she said, because she was a precise woman and imprecision clearly caused her discomfort. "I'm not abandoning them. I'm not removing myself from their lives. I intend to be their aunt in every meaningful sense of that word. I'll come when I can. I'll write. I'll provide whatever they need that you can't. And when they're old enough, I want them to know me and know about Ruth." She paused. "But I'm not taking them from here. From you." Marlowe looked at her. She was trying to read the full shape of what was happening and was finding it larger than anticipated. "Vivian, please let me finish." Vivian's voice had the slight strain of someone holding something steady by main effort. "I came here thinking this was simple. Ruth was gone, the girls needed family, I was family, the logic followed, and I—" She stopped. "I watched you with them for 4 days, both of you, and I watched them with you. And I understand something now that I didn't understand when I got off that carriage." She looked at the babies, at the watchful one against Gideon's shoulder, at the calm one in Marlowe's arms. "They already know where home is. They're 3 weeks old and they already know, and that is not something I can replicate. Not because I wouldn't love them. I would, I do. But because it's already been built here in this specific place by these specific people, and you don't move something like that without breaking it." Gideon looked at Vivian. His expression had the quality of a man witnessing something he wasn't sure he deserved to witness. "There are legal considerations," Vivian continued. "I've spoken with Mercer about the process. He's familiar with the circuit judge, who will be through in 10 days. If both of you are willing, and if you intend what I think you intend—" She looked at Marlowe, then Gideon, then back. "Guardianship can be established properly. I can provide documentation of my consent as the surviving blood relative. The judge will want the household stable, which means—" She paused. "Which means the question of your arrangement will need to be formalized for the court's purposes." The room processed this. "She means we'd need to be married," Gideon said. "For the court's purposes," Vivian agreed with the tone of someone communicating that the court's purposes and her own were not identical, but were, in this case, aligned. Marlowe looked at Gideon. He looked at her. The calm one, apparently deciding that this pause had gone on long enough, made a small declarative sound. Both adults looked at her. She looked back with serene impartiality. "We need to talk," Marlowe said. "Obviously," said Vivian, and picked up the calm one with the competence of someone who had learned this skill recently but thoroughly, and left the room with a precision that suggested she had planned this part. The door closed. Gideon and Marlowe looked at each other across the hotel room with the watchful baby between them on his good shoulder. "Well," Marlowe said. "Well," he agreed. "This is not the conversation I expected to have today. It's not the conversation I expected to have this week." He paused. "Or this decade." She looked at him. He looked at her. The baby, apparently sensing that she was no longer the center of proceedings, turned her head and looked at the wall with philosophical acceptance. "I'm going to say something," Marlowe said, "and I want you to understand that I'm not saying it because of what Vivian just said, or because of the court, or because it's the practical thing. I'm saying it because it's true. And because you said something to me 4 nights ago that I've been thinking about since. What did I say? You said you'd wanted to be there since day 3. You said you just didn't think you had the right to want it. She looked at him steadily. You have the right. You've always had the right. And I want to stop having conversations about what we're going to do eventually and start doing it. He was very still. So, she said, what do you think? He looked at her with the gray eyes that had been exhausted the first night and were something else entirely now. Still tired, still showing every mile of the past weeks, but underneath the tiredness, something settled. Something that had found its coordinates. I think, he said carefully, that I came to this county with nothing except a horse and a clear conscience, and I found 2 babies and a woman who ran toward me instead of away, and then I got myself shot through the side, and somehow this is still the best situation I've been in for 4 years. That's a low bar. It's not as low a bar as it sounds. The almost smile moved across his face. Marlo, I want to marry you. That's true independent of the girls, independent of the court, independent of all of it. I want to stop being temporary. I want to put my name on something and have it stay. She looked at him for a long moment, then put it on this. Your ranch. Our ranch, she said, simply, like it was already done. He reached out with his free hand, the one not supporting the baby, and she took it, and they sat in the hotel room in the morning light with the watchful baby conducting her evaluation of the ceiling and the decision that had been assembling itself for 2 weeks. Finished assembling quietly, without ceremony, in the way that the real decisions usually do. The practical complications were considerable, and they arrived in the order that practical complications always do. Not all at once, but in sequence, each one requiring its own navigation. Gideon needed another 5 days before Fenner would clear him for travel, which meant 5 more days of the hotel, which strained the budget in ways that Marlo managed by selling a fence post order she'd been holding and by accepting, with some difficulty, a loan from Vivian that Vivian presented as a contribution to household establishment and refused to call anything else. The ranch needed attention. The fence work Gideon had done before he rode east was holding, but there were other things accumulating, and Marlo split her time between town and home in a way that was sustainable only because Vivian was still there. And Vivian, it turned out, was not done surprising people. She'd extended her stay without explanation, which Marlo noted and didn't question. She continued with the babies with the systematic competence she'd developed, and she corresponded daily with her household in Chicago via the town telegraph, managing whatever her life there required from a distance. She didn't talk about leaving. She also didn't talk about staying. She existed in a state of deliberate present tense that Marlo recognized as someone making room for a decision they hadn't finished yet. On the 4th day of Gideon's hotel convalescence, Harlan Briggs came to see him. Marlo was there. She had not been invited to be there. Briggs had not sent word ahead, had simply appeared at the hotel room door with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had rehearsed this and found the rehearsal insufficient. She was there because she was there most mornings, and she was not going to leave on Briggs's account. Mr. Voss, Briggs said. He looked at Marlo. Mrs. Ashby. Harlan, Marlo said. He looked back at Gideon. He seemed to be recalibrating. The man in the bed was not the version of Gideon Voss he'd built in his mind. That version had been a drifter, a convenient category, something that could be filed and managed. The man in the chair looking back at him had the particular quality of someone who has recently done something extremely difficult and is still carrying the knowledge of it in his posture. I heard about what happened out at the creek, Briggs said. Most people did, Gideon said. I want to... Briggs stopped, started again. He was not a man who apologized easily, and the word was fighting him visibly. I came to say that I spoke out of turn, about the children, about the arrangement. He turned his hat in his hands. Word has it, the papers from the saddlebags cleared the Calloway murders, that you're the reason those men are in a cell. The sheriff and his deputies are the reason those men are in a cell. The sheriff and his deputies arrived after the situation had been contained. Briggs looked at him. My point is that I had you wrong. The room was quiet. I appreciate you saying that, Gideon said. He said it without warmth, but without hostility either. The tone of a man accepting something at face value and extending exactly as much credit as the thing has earned. Briggs nodded. He looked at Marlo. I also said things that weren't... that were unfair. To you specifically. Marlowe looked at him. She had spent 4 years navigating Harlan Briggs and his calculations, and she knew exactly what this cost him and exactly what it meant, which was less than a full accounting but more than nothing. Thank you, Harlan. The county council will have no further concerns about the arrangement at the Ashby Ranch. He said it formally, as though he were reading into a record, which, in his mind, he probably was. Or about whatever arrangements follow from it. He put his hat back on and left. Marlowe and Gideon looked at each other. Was that an apology? Gideon asked. As close as Harlan Briggs gets to one, yes. How long did that take him to work up to? 4 years for me. About 12 days for you. She considered this. You got a discount for stopping a murder gang. He almost laughed. It turned into a careful expression because laughing still pulled at the wound, which she knew because she'd seen it happen twice and had felt both instances in her own chest. The circuit judge arrived in Harlan County on a Tuesday in early autumn, earlier than Mercer had expected, which meant that everything moved faster than anyone had prepared for. His name was Whitmore, and he was a compact, efficient man who appeared to regard sentiment with the specific suspicion of someone who had seen it used as an argument in court too many times to trust it unreservedly. He reviewed the documentation in Mercer's office. He reviewed the statement from Vivian Holt, which was several pages of precise, carefully organized language that made its case without a single superfluous word. He reviewed Mercer's own account of the children's circumstances. Then he asked to come to the ranch. He came on a Wednesday morning, arriving in Mercer's wagon, and he walked through the house with the assessment of a man doing mathematics. He looked at the crate, now larger. Gideon had built a proper one from wood he'd gotten from the mill, padded correctly, sized for 2. He looked at the kitchen, the sleeping arrangements, the general organization of a household that was clearly being run by someone who knew what they were doing. He looked at Gideon, who was moving carefully but moving, cleared by Fenner 3 days prior, and back at the ranch where he'd promptly resumed useful work at the specifically reduced pace Fenner had mandated. He looked at Marlowe. He looked at the babies. The watchful one looked back at him with her standard evaluative attention. The calm one was asleep. "You intend to marry?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Marlowe said, "before or after I rule on guardianship." "We'd prefer before," Gideon said, "if the court has no objection." Whitmore looked at him. "Why before?" "Because I don't want the decision about the children to be the reason we get married. I want the marriage to be its own thing." He paused. "And because it is its own thing, and I'd like the record to reflect that." Whitmore considered this for a moment. Marlowe watched him and thought that whatever calculation he was running, it was more nuanced than his compressed efficiency suggested. "There's a justice of the peace in this county," Whitmore said. "I've been told he's available Saturday." "That's 4 days," Marlowe said. "Yes." Whitmore looked at her. "Is that sufficient time to make the necessary arrangements?" She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's sufficient." Whitmore nodded. "I'll return Monday for the guardianship proceeding. Come with documentation of the marriage and Miss Holt's notarized consent, and we can finalize the matter efficiently." He left. Marlowe and Gideon stood in the kitchen in the aftermath of his departure, and the house settled around them, and the babies occupied themselves with their respective activities. "Saturday," Gideon said. "Saturday," she agreed. "That's very fast." "Yes." He was quiet a moment. "I don't have a good coat." She looked at him. Something warm moved across her face that she didn't try to contain. "I'll see what the dry goods store has." "You don't need to—" "Gideon." She crossed to him. She put her hand flat against his chest, not the wounded side, the right side, where his heart was doing whatever his heart was doing under the layers of shirt and skin. She felt it, the specific rhythm of a living man, a man who had come back. "I'll see what the dry goods store has." He put his hand over hers. They stood in the kitchen while the babies occupied themselves with the ceiling and the wall and the particular mysteries available to 3-week-old minds in an autumn morning. "All right," he said. The 4 days moved the way days move when they are counted. There was a great deal to do, not ceremony. Neither of them wanted ceremony in the elaborate sense, and the justice of the peace was a practical man who did not require elaborate sense. But there were legal documents to prepare, and Mercer had opinions about witnesses, and Vivian took it upon herself to correspond with her Chicago household for something she had sent on the express stage that arrived Friday evening. It was a dress. Not Vivian's dress. A dress from a seamstress in Chicago, ordered 3 days ago based on measurements Vivian had taken from Marlowe's existing clothes without telling her what they were for. It was a deep blue, the specific blue of late evening sky before the stars appear. And it was not elaborate, and it fit the way that things fit when someone is measured carefully. Marlowe stood in the bedroom and looked at it for a moment before putting it on. And then she put it on and didn't look in the mirror immediately, because she wasn't ready for that yet. Vivian appeared in the doorway. She looked at Marlowe. Something moved across her face that had several components, most of them having to do with her sister, and none of them sayable. "Ruth would have liked you," she said. Marlowe looked at her. "Tell me about her, while I have you." So Vivian told her, leaning against the door frame while Marlowe sat at the small vanity and did something practical with her hair, Vivian talking about Ruth. Not the dead woman from the telegram, but the living one she remembered. Stubborn, funny in a dry way, terrible at accepting help, extraordinary at giving it. A woman who had built a compartment under her wagon floor before her daughters were born because she wanted them to be safe in any version of the world. Marlowe listened. She listened carefully, the way she would listen to anything she intended to keep. "She would have liked him too," Vivian said. "Gideon, she always said you could tell a man's character by what he did when he thought no one was looking. Nobody was looking when he found them." "No." Vivian's voice was quiet. "Nobody at all." They were quiet together for a moment, and outside the window the prairie was doing what it does in autumn. That particular golden brown that makes the distance look like something worth riding toward. "Are you going to be all right?" Marlowe asked. "When you go back?" "I'm not going back yet." Vivian said it with the finality of someone who has made a decision they're not explaining. "I want to see the guardianship finalized. I want to see them settled." She paused. "And I want to learn the calm one's name before I leave. You're going to have to name them properly now, you know." "We've been discussing it." "And?" "And Gideon has opinions about family names." Marlowe looked at the mirror finally, looked at the blue dress, at her own face, which was the face of a woman who had been up since 5 and had done considerable work and was about to go marry someone she had known for 3 weeks and was entirely certain about. "I think we're close." Vivian looked at her for a moment longer. "You look like someone who knows what they're doing," she said. "I'm mostly operating on the principle that the right thing and the certain thing aren't always the same thing, and I've learned to tell the difference." "Is this the right thing?" Marlowe stood up. She smoothed the blue dress once, practical and automatic, and then she stopped doing that because it didn't need smoothing. "Vivian, that man rode 2 days across open country carrying children that weren't his because he could not make himself leave them. And then he fixed my fence without being asked and talked to them in the dark when he thought I was sleeping and went out there and got himself shot rather than let the men who destroyed their family go free." She looked at Vivian. "Is there a version of right that doesn't include him?" Vivian thought about it for a moment. "No," she said. "I don't think there is." They went out into the main room, where Gideon was standing by the door in a coat that was new and fit him properly. Clara Nissen's husband had had something close to the right size, and the alterations had been done overnight by the woman who did the town sewing. And he turned when they came in, and he looked at Marlowe in the blue dress. And he had the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect and is trying to memorize it accurately. "Ready?" she asked. He looked at her for another moment. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." The ceremony was short and honest, which was the only version either of them would have wanted. The justice of the peace was a man named Graves, who had married approximately 40 couples in Harlan County and had developed the talent of reading which pairs needed elaborate language and which needed plain. He read these two correctly and gave them the plain version, direct, unambiguous, requiring only what was true from each of them in front of Mercer and Vivian and 2 other neighbors who had come quietly and stood at the back of the small room. When it was done, Gideon looked at Marlowe. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything profound. There wasn't anything to say that the previous 3 weeks hadn't already said more thoroughly than language could manage. She took his hand and he held it, and they went outside into the autumn afternoon, and the town went on around them, ordinary and present, and the babies were with Vivian in the wagon, And everything that had assembled itself from that evening when a horse stopped at her fence line and didn't move, all of it had arrived, finally, at something that had a shape and a name and would continue. Marlowe looked at the sky above Harlan County, that wide Nebraska sky that didn't ask permission before it took your breath away. "Well," she said. "Well," Gideon said. He was still holding her hand. They went to get the girls. Judge Whitmore arrived on Monday morning exactly when he said he would, which Marlowe had expected, and he brought a clerk with a leather satchel full of forms, which she had also expected, and he sat at her kitchen table and reviewed every document with the systematic attention of a man who believed that paperwork, done correctly, was one of the more reliable forms of human kindness. Vivian's notarized consent was 7 pages. Whitmore read all 7. He asked 2 questions, one about the financial arrangement for the girls' welfare, one about the plan if circumstances changed, and he received answers he appeared to find satisfactory, though his face gave nothing away about the degree of satisfaction. Gideon sat across the table. Marlowe sat beside him. The babies were in the new crate that Gideon had built, the one with the proper padding and the correct dimensions, which sat in the corner of the kitchen where it had been since the day he'd finished it, as though it had always meant to be there. Whitmore looked up from the documents. He looked at the crate. He looked at the 2 adults across his table. "The children need names for the record," he said. "Legal names." Marlowe looked at Gideon. They had talked about this, talked about it carefully. The way you talk about something when you understand it carries weight beyond its immediate practical function. "Ruth," Marlowe said. "The older one. Ruth Eleanor." She paused. "Eleanor was my mother." Whitmore's clerk wrote it down without expression. "And the other?" Whitmore said. "May," Gideon said. "May Josephine." He was quiet for a moment. "Josephine was her mother, the woman who built the compartment." The clerk wrote it down. Whitmore looked at the crate again. The baby, who was now officially Ruth Eleanor Voss, was conducting her morning evaluation of the kitchen ceiling. The baby, who was now May Josephine Voss, was asleep, which was her considered position on most official proceedings. "Ruth Eleanor and May Josephine," Whitmore said. He said it like a man reading a record into permanence. "All right." He set down his pen. "Legal guardianship is hereby established in the persons of Gideon and Marlowe Voss, effective today, subject to the standard welfare reviews." He looked at them both. "Take care of them." "Yes," Marlowe said. The word was plain and absolute. Whitmore signed the forms. His clerk witnessed. Mercer, who had come along as an officer of the county record, signed where indicated. Vivian signed her portion with a steadiness that cost her something. Marlowe could see it in the set of her jaw, and then sat back with the expression of someone who has done a hard right thing and is waiting for it to feel the way right things are supposed to feel. It took a moment, but it came. Whitmore closed his satchel and stood. He shook Gideon's hand, then Marlowe's, with the efficiency of a man whose schedule was already planning the next stop. At the door he paused. "I've been doing this work for 22 years, he said, without turning around. "This particular kind of case, where the right arrangement and the legal arrangement manage to find each other, that's not as common as it should be." He put his hat on. "Good morning." He left. The kitchen was quiet. Ruth Eleanor looked at the ceiling. May Josephine slept. Mercer cleared his throat and said he needed to get back to town, and Vivian walked him out, and Gideon and Marlowe were left at the kitchen table with the signed papers between them and the babies in the corner and the morning light coming through the window. The way it did, particular to this house, particular to this piece of Nebraska, golden and unhurried. Gideon looked at the papers. He reached out and touched the edge of the document where the names were written. Ruth Eleanor, May Josephine, Voss, with the careful finger of a man handling something he doesn't want to damage. Marlowe watched him. "Okay?" she said. He looked up. His gray eyes had the quality they sometimes got. That depth underneath the surface calm, the thing that had been there since the beginning, and that she had learned to read as the place where Gideon kept the things that mattered most. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." She put her hand over his on the document. "They have names now." "They have names." He turned his hand under hers. "They have a home." "They always had a home," she said. "We just made it official." Vivian left on a Thursday. The decision had been made quietly. The the way Vivienne made most decisions. It appeared one morning as a fact rather than a process, already resolved. She had arranged her passage back to Chicago, had sent word to her household, had packed with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing her own affairs for a long time and did not require assistance doing so. She spent her last morning with the girls. Marlowe gave her the time without comment, understood, without being told, that this needed to happen without an audience of well-meaning adults. She went out to work the fence on the east side, which needed it, and she left Vivienne alone in the house with Ruth and May and whatever she needed to say to them. When she came back an hour later, Vivienne was sitting in the chair with Ruth against her shoulder and May on her lap, looking at both of them with an expression that was about Ruth Calloway and about these two small lives and about the specific weight of continuing forward when someone you loved wasn't going to. She looked up when Marlowe came in. "I'm going to come back," she said, "in the spring, if that's acceptable." "It's more than acceptable. I want to bring things for them, books, when they're old enough." Vivienne looked at Ruth, who was examining Vivienne's collar button with focused intent. Ruth always said that a child who grew up with books grew up with more worlds than just this one. "Then bring books." Marlowe sat across from her. "Bring yourself. Come whenever you can." Vivienne nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about what she would say, Ruth, about all of this." She shifted May slightly. I think she'd say that the compartment worked." Marlowe looked at her. "She built it to keep them safe no matter what happened," Vivienne said. "And it worked. They're safe. They're more than safe." Her voice was even, but only technically. She did what she set out to do. Marlowe didn't say anything for a moment. She felt the truth of this settle, the specific, difficult truth that some people do the most important thing they'll ever do without knowing it's the last thing they'll do, and that the importance doesn't diminish for the not knowing, maybe even grows. "The compartment worked," she said. Vivienne passed May to her. She stood up with Ruth and walked to the crate and set her down with the practiced competence of someone who had learned this specific skill over the past 2 weeks and was going to carry it with her. She looked at them both, at Ruth already reaching for something invisible above her, at May settling into her habitual philosophical rest. "May is going to sleep through everything," Vivienne said. "Important moments, difficult conversations, all of it. We know. Ruth is going to argue about everything. We suspect. She's going to be exactly like her mother." Vivienne's voice was steady. "That's not a bad thing. Ruth was difficult in the best possible way." She picked up her traveling bag from beside the door. She looked at Marlowe. They were not women who did things with a great deal of ceremony, either of them, and the goodbye that happened was therefore short and direct, and carried considerably more weight than its length suggested. Gideon drove her to town in the wagon. Marlowe stood on the porch and watched them go, and she held May, who was awake, for once, and watching the departing wagon with what might have been attention and might have been coincidence. And she thought about Ruth Calloway building a compartment under a wagon floor, and about Gideon finding it, and about everything that a single act of foresight had set in motion, the improbable chain of it, and how you could follow that chain backward as far as it went, and find at every link someone doing the next necessary thing without knowing how it would land. May made a small sound. "I know," Marlowe said, to nobody in particular. "I know." The trial was in November. Cord Dalloway and his 2 surviving men were transported to the territorial court under guard, which was the correct procedure, and Mercer handled the transfer with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. The documentation from the saddlebags proved to be more comprehensive than anyone had anticipated. Not just the Calloway papers, but records from multiple robberies, the specific arrogance of men who kept accounts of their own crimes the way businessmen keep ledgers. Gideon gave testimony in person. He did it with the same flat, precise economy he brought to everything. No embellishment, no performance, just the sequence of what had happened laid out in the order it had happened. The prosecutor, a young man from the territorial office named Garrett, told Mercer afterward that Gideon Voss was the best witness he'd had in 3 years of practice, because he said exactly what he knew and stopped precisely where knowing ended. Dalloway's lawyer attempted to raise questions about the circumstances of the confrontation at the creek, about a civilian engaging in what he called vigilante action, about the absence of proper authorization. Whitmore, who had been assigned to the case, Listen to this argument with the expression of a man familiar with it and not particularly troubled. He let it run its course. Then he asked Gideon 3 questions in the measured tone of someone constructing a record with care. He asked whether Gideon had observed the deputy's body before acting. He asked whether he had attempted to prevent the gang's escape by the means available to him. He asked what he had found in the saddlebags when the confrontation was concluded. Gideon answered all 3. The third answer, the itemized list of what the saddlebags contained, read into the record in Gideon's specific flat voice, went on for a while. When it was finished, the courtroom was quiet in the particular way of a room that has just been given a concrete shape to something abstract. Dalloway was convicted on all counts, so were the other 2. The sentences were long enough to constitute the remainder of their useful lives, which was the appropriate proportion. Mercer shook Gideon's hand outside the courthouse. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Gideon rode home. He arrived at the ranch at dusk, which had become his preferred arrival time without his planning it that way, the particular light of late afternoon on the Nebraska prairie having established itself as the light he associated with coming back to something. He put the horse in the barn. He walked to the house. He could hear before he opened the door the specific sounds of the household, a baby somewhere between content and not. Marlowe's voice at a register he recognized as the one she used when she was managing something with her hands and talking at the same time. He opened the door. The kitchen was warm. Marlowe was at the stove with May on her hip. May, who was apparently now awake and interested in the world, which was a recent development that had been greeted by everyone with a mixture of delight and the knowledge that things were about to get more complicated. Ruth was in the crate, standing up against the edge of it. She had figured out standing 2 days ago and had immediately applied this capability to the project of escaping the crate, which was ongoing. Marlowe looked up. "How did it go?" "Done," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face. "All of it?" "All of it." She nodded once, a slow nod, the kind that's processing rather than responding. She turned back to the stove, then turned back to him. Ruth figured out how to stand. "I see that. She's been doing it for 2 days, and she keeps looking at the edge like she's calculating." "She is calculating. I know she is." Marlowe sounded resigned in the specific way of a parent who knows exactly what's coming and is preparing for it. May decided to be awake today, by the way. Both of them, simultaneously awake. It was a lot. "I can imagine. You should have been here." "I was in a territorial court." "I know. I'm just noting." She transferred May to him as he crossed the kitchen. The handoff as automatic now as anything could be, the specific adjustment of weight and position that both of them did without thinking. May regarded him with the alert attention of someone who had been asleep for most of his absence and had things to catch up on. "Hey," he said to her. May put her hand on his face. This was new. He stood in the kitchen with May's hand on his jaw and Ruth demonstrating her standing capability against the crate edge and Marlowe at the stove, and the house smelled of whatever was cooking and of the cold air he'd brought in with him. And underneath both of those things of the particular smell that a house gets when it has been consistently lived in by people who intend to stay. And Gideon stood in the middle of all of it and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Too specific for happiness, too present for relief. Something in the territory of arrived. "They're going to be a lot of work," Marlowe said, not turning around. "Yes. More than either of us has done before." "Probably. Ruth is already difficult and she can't talk yet. When she can talk, she'll be magnificent," he said. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. A short, real laugh, not performed, the kind that gets away from you. "Yes," she said. "She'll be magnificent." Winter came to Nebraska the way it always does, without particularly asking permission, arriving in the first week of December with the specific authority of something that has been coming for months and finally stopped pretending otherwise. The ranch settled into its winter rhythms. Gideon had spent the fall months making it ready. More wood than they'd need, the barn insulated to a standard that would keep the horses comfortable, the house sealed against the drafts that had apparently characterized every previous winter according to Marlowe's accounts. He did this systematically and without drama, the way he did most things, moving from one necessary task to the next with the patience of someone who has finally found a project worth finishing. Marlowe watched him that fall and thought about what it meant when a person stopped performing competence and just was competent, when the proving was over and the living started. She thought about how she'd spent 4 years alone on this land and hadn't known, specifically, what was missing until it showed up in the form of an exhausted man with 2 babies and a gray horse and nothing much to offer except his own character, which turned out to be sufficient. She didn't say any of this to him directly. Some things you keep in the interior of yourself, not because they're secret, but because they're too precisely true to survive translation. He knew anyway. She could tell he knew because of the way he moved through the house, not carefully, the way a guest moves, but with the ease of someone who has stopped measuring the distance between themselves and the space they're in. There were hard days. That needs saying, because the alternative is a kind of lie. There were nights when one or both babies refused any known form of comfort, and the tiredness got deep enough that it stopped being tiredness and became a kind of basic alteration of the person. And things were said in those hours that were sharper than intended and had to be accounted for in the morning. There were days when the wound in Gideon's side reminded him it was still healing, flaring at inconvenient moments, setting limits on what he could lift and how long he could work, which frustrated him in the specific way that physical limitation always frustrated people who had relied on their bodies as their primary tool. There were disagreements about small things that were actually about larger things, which is the way it always works. The argument about where to store the extra feed becoming the argument about whose judgment to trust on ranch decisions, which was actually the argument about what this partnership meant and how its authority was distributed. They had that argument on a Thursday in October, and it was uncomfortable, and neither of them handled it gracefully, and it took the better part of 2 days to arrive at the resolution, which was that the ranch was both of theirs, and the decisions were both of theirs, and the discomfort of working that out was less than the discomfort of leaving it unworked. They left it worked out. That was the thing that mattered. Not that the hard days didn't happen, but that they consistently moved through them rather than around them. Marlowe had learned from 4 years of running a ranch alone that the problems you move around accumulate. The ones you move through at least stay singular. Gideon had learned something similar from 4 years of moving through a landscape and never stopping long enough for anything to accumulate, which was a different lesson with the same shape. In January, a letter came from Vivian. It was long, 6 pages in Vivian's precise handwriting, the kind of handwriting that reveals a person's character without meaning to, controlled and exact and occasionally breaking into something less careful in the margins where she'd added thoughts after. She wrote about Chicago, about her household, about a project she had undertaken to donate a portion of her income to a fund for displaced families on the western frontier, which she said had started as something small and was becoming something she hadn't anticipated. She wrote about Ruth and James Calloway. She had, she said, gone to speak with their families, James's brother in Ohio, who had not known they'd died until Vivian's letter arrived. A cousin of Ruth's on the maternal side, an elderly woman in Pennsylvania who had known Ruth as a child. She had told them both about the girls. She had told them that Ruth Eleanor and May Josephine were alive and well and loved. She wrote, "The cousin, whose name is Agnes, cried for a long time. Then she said that Ruth was always the one who found a way to make things come out right. I thought about the compartment when she said that. I thought about how Ruth made a way for those girls to survive something unsurvivable, and how she did it without knowing she was doing it, or maybe she did know, maybe somewhere she knew. I don't have a way to be certain about that, but I choose to believe it." She enclosed a photograph, herself, in a photographer's studio, formal and composed, the way people look in photographs because photographs require stillness. On the back, in the margin script, for Ruth Eleanor and May Josephine. So they know what their aunt looks like from the beginning. Marlowe read the letter at the kitchen table, then passed it to Gideon without comment. He read it the same way he read everything, straight through, once, without expression, which was how she knew he was actually moved. "Spring," he said. "She's coming in April. She said so. We should fix the guest room." He set the letter down. "The latch on the window is loose." "I know. I'll do it this week." Marlowe looked at him. I was looking at the letter, at the photograph, at the controlled handwriting of a woman trying to be adequate to something larger than control. She thought about what it meant to receive care from an unexpected direction, to have someone arrive in your life through grief and stay through choice. She's part of this, Marlowe said. Yes. He picked up the photograph. She always was. We just didn't know it yet. The girls changed month by month in the specific rapid way of infants, each week adding some new capacity that rearranged the household's understanding of what they were dealing with. Ruth, as predicted, was difficult in the best possible way. She developed opinions early and communicated them with remarkable efficiency given her limited vocabulary. The particular pitch and duration of her sounds already calibrated to specific requests, none of which she expected to be ignored. She had Gideon precisely mapped within the first months. She knew what he would give in on and what he wouldn't, and she reserved her most persuasive efforts for the former and conducted herself with relative equanimity about the latter. When she looked at him with those watchful eyes that had been watching since the first night, he was consistently undone, which she seemed to understand and not abuse, because Ruth, it turned out, was difficult but fair. May was a revelation of a different kind. She had been the calm one, the philosophical one, the one who slept through official proceedings and observed everything with detached equanimity. And she was still that, but she was also, Marlowe discovered around the fourth month, paying extraordinarily close attention. May didn't announce her observations. She stored them. When she finally began to be vocal about things, what emerged was a precision that seemed unlikely in someone who had been alive for such a short time. She noticed things. She noticed when Gideon was tired before he showed it. She noticed when Marlowe was frustrated before Marlowe was ready to admit it. She would simply redirect her attention to whichever adult needed redirecting and wait with patient confidence for them to catch up. She's going to be something, Gideon said one evening, watching May watch him from across the room. Ruth is going to run things, Marlowe said. May is going to understand them. He thought about this. That's a lot of power in one household. We have an advantage. What's that? We were there first. She looked at him. Marginally. He almost laughed. The laugh had become a more reliable thing as the months went on. Not frequent, not performed, but present when it came. It still caught her off guard sometimes, the way his face changed when it happened. By the time spring arrived, the ranch had become something different from what it had been. Not transformed in the dramatic sense. The land was the same land, the house was the same house, the work was the work that the work had always been. But the texture of the place had changed, the way a family changes a space not by altering it, but by inhabiting it fully, so that the walls and the floors, and the way the light comes through the windows in the morning, become part of something larger than their physical function. Gideon had rebuilt the northern fence correctly, finally, and had added a proper storage structure near the barn that solved a problem Marlowe had been managing around for years. He had done these things in stages, working within his healing limits in the fall and at fuller capacity by winter and by spring. The ranch looked the way it looked when people were taking care of it with the specific attention of people who intend to be there indefinitely. Mercer came out occasionally for reasons that were officially about county business and were actually about checking in, which Marlowe appreciated without commenting on. He had the specific loyalty of a man who had seen things go right in situations where they often didn't, and he held that observation close. Briggs had done what he said he would. The county council had no further formal concerns. He still crossed the street when he saw Gideon in town, which was its own kind of commentary, but the commentary had become background noise rather than a threat, which was a manageable outcome. The territory was changing around them. More families moving through, more claims being filed, more of the particular friction that happens when people try to build permanent things in places that haven't decided yet what permanence looks like. Gideon had developed, without planning it, a reputation that made certain situations easier to navigate. The story of the creek bed had traveled the way stories travel on the frontier, gathering detail and losing accuracy as it went, until the version that was circulating bore only moderate resemblance to what had actually happened. But the core of it remained, a man who had done a difficult thing when it needed doing, and paid for it, and kept his word. He wore this reputation the way he wore everything, without much apparent awareness of it, using it only when it was useful and leaving it alone otherwise. Marlowe watched him become part of the county the way she had become part of it, which was slowly and through the accumulation of presence rather than through any single moment of arrival. She watched him and thought about how it happens. How a person who has been in motion for long enough starts to read as settled, not because the motion stops exactly, but because the direction becomes consistent, becomes oriented toward a fixed point. The fixed point was this: the ranch, the girls, her. She thought he probably didn't think of it in those terms. Gideon thought in direct, functional language that didn't leave a lot of room for the symbolic. But the fixed point quality was visible in him whether he articulated it or not, in the way he came home at the same hour each evening, in the way he knew without being told which baby was crying and what it meant, in the way he sat at the kitchen table in the morning with his coffee and looked out the window at the land with the expression of someone taking an inventory they expect to take again tomorrow. Vivienne came in April. She arrived on a Tuesday with a trunk that had to be moved by two men and which turned out to contain, among other things, approximately 40 children's books, several items of clothing sized for where the girls would be in 6 months' time, and a rocking chair that had been disassembled for shipping and that Gideon reassembled in the main room over the course of an afternoon while Vivienne and Marlowe sat nearby telling him he was doing it wrong, which he was not. "I'm not doing it wrong," he said, for the third time. "The left arm goes before the seat," Vivienne said, with the confidence of someone who had watched it being built and therefore considered herself an authority. "The seat has to be anchored first or the left arm doesn't align." "That seems backward." "It's not backward." Marlowe watched this exchange and felt something she could only describe as abundance, the specific, uncomfortable richness of having more good things in one room than you'd been prepared for. Ruth was in Vivienne's lap, examining the buttons on Vivienne's traveling jacket with the focused attention she brought to all tactile investigations. She had taken to Vivienne immediately, which surprised no one who knew Ruth because Ruth's approval process was rapid and definitive and once decided, essentially permanent. May was watching Gideon assemble the chair with her characteristic alert patience, tracking each step with the eyes that tracked everything. "She's watching you work," Vivienne said to Gideon. "She always watches." "Does it bother you?" He looked at May. She looked back at him with serene attention. "No," he said. "I like it. Feels like being held accountable. By a 5-month-old. By a 5-month-old who's paying more attention than most adults." He fitted the left arm into position. "There, left arm." Vivienne looked at the assembled joint. "You were right. I know. You could have just said so without the explanation." The explanation was for Marlowe. Marlowe looked up. "I didn't say anything. You were thinking it. I was thinking you were taking too long. That's different from thinking I was doing it wrong." "Only slightly." But she was smiling, the particular smile that she had, not wide, not performed, the one that showed in the corners rather than the center, that you had to know to look for. He set the rocking chair in its place in the main room and sat down in it to test the stability, and Ruth immediately abandoned Vivienne and crossed the floor at her current top speed, a determined crawl that had been operational for 3 weeks and showed no signs of becoming less urgent, and arrived at his feet and looked up at him with the expression of someone who has arrived where she intended. He picked her up. She grabbed his shirt collar. He rocked. Vivienne watched this from across the room with Ruth's dark eyes and her sister's face, and she said nothing for a moment, and then she said quietly to Marlowe, "That's what I told you I couldn't replicate." "I know," Marlowe said. "I was right. You were right." Marlowe looked at her. "But you're also here. So it's both." Vivienne considered this. "It's both," she agreed. There is a thing that happens to families, not all families, but the ones that survive becoming themselves, where the early difficulty begins to look, in retrospect, less like difficulty and more like the work that was necessary to arrive at the thing that followed. This is not a comfortable thing to acknowledge while you're in it. The sleepless nights do not feel like necessary work while they're happening. The argument on the Thursday in October did not feel, during its several uncomfortable hours, like the foundation of a better understanding. The days when Gideon's wound flared and his patience went with it did not feel like character-building exercises to anyone present. But on the other side of those things, you can see them differently, not comfortably. There's something slightly dishonest about making peace with difficulty too completely, about turning suffering into narrative too smoothly. The people in the creek bed don't benefit from the story having a good ending. Young Aldred's family does not find comfort in the fact that Gideon came home. Those things remain what they are, and they should. What's true alongside that is this: the family that assembled itself in Harlan County, Nebraska, in the late autumn of 1876 was not the kind of family that gets planned. It did not emerge from a reasonable sequence of events in which people followed the expected path from A to B. It emerged from an outlaw gang and a hidden compartment, and a man who could not leave children in the dark, and a woman who opened a gate. The choosing of it, that's where the meaning lives. Not in the convenient accident of how it started, but in the choosing of it, again and again, through the consecutive ordinary days that followed. The choice to come back. The choice to stay. The choice to say, come home and mean it. The choice to sign 7 pages of careful language that made something permanent. Most of what matters in a life is like this, in the end. Not the moment of collision that sets things in motion, but the accumulated daily decision to keep going in a particular direction because the thing you're going toward is worth the going. On a morning in late spring, Marlowe woke before dawn and lay in the quiet for a moment, listening to the house. Ruth was asleep. She could tell from the absence of the specific alertness that Ruth radiated even in rest, that presence, that forward-leaning quality of a child who is already planning her next position. May was asleep. May slept with commitment, with her whole body arranged in the attitude of someone who has decided that sleep is worth doing properly. Gideon was not in the bed. She lay still a moment longer and she heard, from the main room, the sound of the rocking chair. The particular creak of it, slow and rhythmic, the sound of something in motion that intends to stay. She got up. She crossed the house in the early dark, barefoot on the wood floor, and she stood in the doorway of the main room. Gideon was in the rocking chair. Ruth was against his left shoulder, her dark head tucked under his jaw, small fingers tangled in his shirt. May was against his right shoulder, in the way she had, the solid, committed way of a child who had decided this was her place and was not interested in reconsidering. He was asleep. Not the light doze of someone who might surface with a sound, but fully, completely asleep. The sleep of a man who had been in motion for 4 years and had finally stopped, and his body was making up the debt. His head had dropped to rest against the top of Ruth's. His arms held both girls in the automatic grip of someone whose hands had learned this and weren't going to forget it. His face, in the early gray light, was at rest in the way it rarely managed when he was awake. The watchfulness gone, the control gone. Just a man who was exactly where he was, and nothing more complicated than that. Marlowe stood in the doorway and looked at this for a long time. She thought about the evening it had started, the horse at her fence line that wasn't moving, the arms that were out in front of him, the 2 small lives held against the body of a man who had not slept in 2 days and could not put them down. She thought about how she had run toward it instead of away from it, which had seemed obvious at the time and seemed more significant now. She thought about what it costs to keep going after loss, about how some people stop being able to imagine a future and just start moving laterally through a present that doesn't lead anywhere, and about how the movement looks like life from the outside and feels like a different thing from the inside. She had been doing it, in her own way, in the 4 years since Thomas. Gideon had been doing it in the 4 years since his daughter's 9 days. They had both been moving laterally, adjacent to their own lives, and then a horse had stopped at her fence, and the direction had changed. She didn't think that was rescue. She had been standing upright before he arrived. So had he. What she thought it was finding, the specific finding that happens when you're already looking, when you haven't entirely given up on the possibility of a direction, when you've kept going even though the going felt like going nowhere, and then one day something is there that wasn't before, and the nothing becomes aware. He had been going somewhere without knowing what it was. So had she. And now they were in the same somewhere, in the early light of a spring morning, with 2 daughters named after women who had loved them before they were born, and a rocking chair Gideon had assembled correctly, and the ranch outside beginning to wake under a sky that was doing what the Nebraska sky does, becoming enormous, becoming present, belonging to nobody, and available to everyone who was standing under it. Marlowe crossed the room and sat on the footstool beside the rocking chair and leaned her shoulder against the arm of it and closed her eyes. She could hear all 3 of them breathing. The rhythm of it, the specific intermesh of 3 people asleep in the same space, was the most particular sound she had ever heard. She stayed there as the light came up outside, as the prairie woke around the house, as the ordinary morning began to assemble itself from the dark. She stayed and she listened and she did not sleep, because some mornings are for witnessing rather than resting, and this was one of them. The cowboy who had ridden in from nowhere with someone else's children in his arms slept on in the rocking chair. The children who had survived the unsurvivable and been carried out of the dark and given names slept against his shoulders. And Marlowe Voss sat beside them in the early light and thought, this is the thing. This particular arrangement of people in a room. This is the thing that was worth every mile of the getting here. Not the dramatic miles, not the gunfire or the courtroom or the documents signed with trembling hands. The ordinary ones. The miles of feeding and sleeping and arguing about fence posts and learning which baby needed to be held higher and remembering to fix the window latch. The miles of deciding, every unremarkable day, that this was where you were going. Outside, the spring prairie opened in every direction, vast and indifferent and full of distance. It did not care about any of this. It had been here before these people arrived, and it would be here after. But in the room, in the light, in the specific geography of a man asleep in a rocking chair with a child on each arm, something had taken hold that the distance couldn't reach. It was small, as most real things are. It was imperfect, as all living things must be. It was home.